Somewhere beneath the amber glow of the Mojave night, scattered across cracked asphalt and sun-bleached desert, the world of Fallout New Vegas holds an extraordinary number of quiet, overlooked details that most wanderers never pause long enough to notice. The neon signs still flicker above the strip, casting pale light across streets that carry the weight of 200 years of silence and story. There are small things hiding everywhere in this game, inside menus, folded into dialogue, stitched along the edges of textures, things that serve no grand purpose but exist all the same, patient and strange and oddly beautiful. If this kind of calm exploration feels right to you, consider subscribing to join the Sleepy Club and let me know where you're watching from tonight as we begin with the desert cooling gently around us and the lights of New Vegas glowing somewhere far off. Let us drift together through these softly with the kind of detail that only this world could offer, something tucked into the Mojave that almost no one ever sees. The flies that circle various remains scattered across the Mojave Desert in Fallout New Vegas are not generic insect models pulled from a shared folder. They are, in fact, scaled-down versions of the bloatfly enemy model, rendered at extremely low polygon counts, so they appear convincingly small. The developers could have used any simplified insect texture to create the illusion of decay, but they chose to build something specifically consistent with the world's own creatures. It is a detail that exists entirely beneath notice during normal play, meaningful only if you stop and look closely at something most players walk past without a second thought. This kind of specificity runs throughout Fallout New Vegas in ways that speak to the care its creators placed into even the smallest corners. The bloatfly is one of the oldest enemies in the Fallout series, appearing in various forms since the earliest entries. Seeing its form miniaturized and repurposed as ambient world decoration suggests that the designers thought about even the insects of the wasteland as inhabitants with their own ecology, not just obstacles. It connects a small environmental detail to the larger fabric of what the Mojave feels like as a living, mutated place. There is something quietly satisfying about a detail like this. It does not reward you with experience points or open a quest. It simply exists as a confirmation that this world was built with attention, that somewhere a developer made a deliberate choice to populate the edges of the game with creatures that belong there. The wasteland feels more complete for it, even if most players never consciously register what they are seeing when they pass by. That sense of hidden completeness echoes across many of the game's most overlooked moments. Fallout New Vegas was developed by Obsidian Entertainment in approximately 18 months, a development window widely considered extraordinarily short for a game of its scale. Despite that, the team embedded an almost unreasonable number of specific details into the world, details that suggest a passion for the universe rather than an obligation to ship a product. The flies around a body in the Mojave are, in their own tiny way, a symbol of that passion. Inside Vault 22, tucked away from the plant-choked corridors and spore-filled air, players who explore carefully enough will find a room belonging to a character named Sarah. Inside that room, mounted quietly on the wall, hangs a portrait. The faces in that portrait are recognizable to those familiar with Fallout 3. They belong to James and Catherine, the parents of the lone wanderer from the previous game in the series. It is an image that Obsidian carried over from Bethesda's work, either as a deliberate Easter egg celebrating the shared Vault tech universe, or simply as a reused asset that found its way into the decoration without anyone changing it. Whether the inclusion was intentional or accidental remains a pleasant uncertainty. Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas are set roughly simultaneously, with both games taking place in the same year following the Great War. The presence of those two faces inside a vault in the Mojave creates a quiet cross-game connection, a moment where two separate stories inhabit the same frame without any dialogue or quest drawing attention to them. It is the kind of detail that rewards players who have spent time with both games and who approach the world with genuine curiosity. The room itself is not particularly notable in terms of gameplay. It holds no unique items of significance, no terminal entries that alter your understanding of the story. It is simply a space inside a vault that was consumed by nature, where someone once lived and worked and left a picture on the wall. That picture happens to carry its own weight, silently connecting the world of the capital wasteland to the Mojave, in a way that no piece of dialogue ever establishes. Two worlds, briefly sharing the same quiet surface. Not far from the entrance to New Vegas proper, positioned between Freeside and Camp McCarran, the famous Welcome to Fabulous New Vegas sign rises from the desert ground in a wash of lights and color. Most players pass it during early travel, noting it as a landmark and moving on. But if you look carefully at the letter O in the word welcome, something small and deliberate catches the eye. A tiny smiley face has been drawn inside the curve of that letter, visible only if you stand close enough and angle your view just right. It is one of those details that someone in the development team placed as a personal note, a small signature of optimism embedded into the entrance of a dangerous and complicated city. The sign itself is a loving recreation of the real-world Welcome to Fabulous Las Vegas sign located on the Las Vegas Strip, which has welcomed visitors to the city since 1959. The Fallout version carries the same general silhouette and arrangement, translated into the retrofuturist aesthetic of the game's pre-war design language. The smiley face inside the O does not appear in any loading screen tip or guide. It was discovered by players who took time to stand still in front of the sign and look at it carefully rather than simply using it as a navigational reference. That kind of discovery process, finding a small warmth in an unexpected place, reflects something meaningful about how Fallout New Vegas approaches its world. Even in the shadow of a city built on exploitation and power struggles, someone found space to leave a tiny smile. There is something touching about that gesture. The wasteland is full of messages left by survivors, warnings scratched into walls, prayers recorded on holotapes, notes written to people who may never read them. The smiley face in the welcome sign fits into that tradition, even though it came from a developer's keyboard rather than an in-world hand. It functions as a real-world note embedded in a fictional world, a kind of wink across the boundary between the made and the imagined. The Wild Wasteland trait in Fallout New Vegas is one of the most quietly rewarding character creation choices in the game. Selecting it at the start of your playthrough flags your character for a series of unusual encounters and altered dialogue options that would otherwise remain invisible. One of the most peaceful of these hidden moments involves a small group of aliens located north of New Vegas, encountered only by players who carry this trait. Most players who stumble across this encounter respond with immediate hostility, and the aliens return in kind. But there is a softer path available. If you approach carefully enough, staying hidden and choosing your actions with patience, and if you eliminate only the alien captain while leaving the other two figures untouched, something unexpected happens. The remaining aliens do not attack. They simply remain where they are, standing quietly in the desert, no longer hostile to the wanderer who just removed their leader. It is a strange and gentle outcome for an encounter that is already strange by design. The Wild Wasteland trait is generally associated with absurdity, encounters with deranged old women wielding rolling pins, references to old science fiction films, moments that break the fourth wall in playful ways. But this alien encounter carries a different quality. Two beings from somewhere far beyond the Mojave, left peaceful in the desert by a measured decision, neither attacking nor fleeing. It functions almost like a small treaty, unacknowledged and wordless. The fact that this outcome requires both the trait and a specific method of approach means that most players will never see it. It exists in the space of possibilities that only careful, curious players uncover, the kind of outcome that feels like a reward not for power or skill, but for thoughtfulness. In a game full of choices with sweeping consequences, this tiny moment of interplanetary nonviolence stands quietly on its own. During the development of Fallout New Vegas, Obsidian built and populated a test cell for internal debugging purposes. Inside that cell lived a character the team named Testicles, the Debug Centurion, a placeholder NPC who served as a direct interface for adjusting save file variables without navigating menus. Speaking to this character allowed testers and developers to alter quest outcomes, adjust reputation levels with various factions, and even spawn specific companions like Rex the cybernetic dog directly into the game. This testing NPC was not removed from the game's files entirely, which means players on personal computers can summon him using console commands. What makes this detail particularly interesting is the model Obsidian chose for this character. It is the same model later used for Ron the narrator, the in-game version of Ron Perlman, who delivers the famous War Never Changes opening monologue. During the game's ending slideshow, Ron the narrator exists as a functional NPC rather than simply a voice, and that functional version uses the same visual design as the Debug Centurion. The connection between a developer testing tool and the game's most famous narrative voice is one of those accidental overlaps that becomes more interesting the longer you think about it. Ron Perlman's words frame the entire Fallout universe, lending it gravity and a sense of historical weight. The idea that somewhere beneath that gravitas lives a character originally built to let developers reset quest flags is a perfectly Fallout contradiction. Solemn surface, absurd foundation. Testicles, the Debug Centurion never made it into the final game in any intended way, but his presence in the files is a reminder that every polished release contains layers of scaffolding beneath it. The grand architecture of the Mojave was built from the inside out, and for a period of time, a badly named Centurion stood at the center of it, holding the whole thing together. In Fallout New Vegas, sneak skill functions as one of the most rewarding statistics to develop, offering not just mechanical advantages in avoiding detection, but also access to entirely unique lines of dialogue that cannot be heard any other way. If your character has cultivated a sneak skill above 60, approaching a character named Ghost at Camp Forlorn Hope becomes a distinctly different experience than it is for less silent wanderers. Ghost is a scout, quiet by nature, and attuned to the kind of awareness that silent characters would recognize. Approaching her with sufficient stealth triggers a line of dialogue that she delivers without alarm, acknowledging that she simply did not hear you coming up the ramp. She notes that she likes someone who does not broadcast their movements. She asks, with genuine interest and no hostility, whether you might be a courier, because if so, this might be your lucky day if you do not mind walking a bit, and if your eyes are good. It is a brief moment, functional and understated, but it transforms the interaction entirely. Rather than the default dialogue that greets most players, this version positions Ghost and the player character in a shared register, two people who understand the value of silence, acknowledging each other as equals before any mission or task is mentioned. The game does not announce that you have accessed special dialogue. It simply lets it happen as naturally as a quiet conversation between two quiet people. These hidden dialogue checks scattered throughout New Vegas are part of what made the game feel so dense with possibility. Each statistic was not just a number affecting damage output or carrying capacity, but a lens through which the world responded to you differently. A high sneak skill did not just let you pick pockets, it changed how people spoke to you when they finally noticed you were there. At the Sloan Quarry south of New Vegas, players meet a small mole rat named Snuffles, recognizable immediately by the splint on one of her legs. She is used as part of a quest involving the quarry workers, and most players interact with her briefly before moving on. But Snuffles carries a small statistical distinction that has delighted Fallout fans since the game's release. Her intelligence score in the game's underlying data sits at 5. Caesar, the leader of Caesar's Legion and one of the game's most educated and rhetorically capable major characters, holds an intelligence score of 4 in the same data. This means that Snuffles the injured mole rat is, by the game's own mechanics, measurably more intelligent than one of the most powerful and learned figures in the Mojave. Caesar attended the followers of the Apocalypse, studied Edward Sallow's extensive knowledge of Roman history, and built an empire from the wreckage of old tribal societies. Snuffles lives at a quarry and wears a leg splint. The most common explanation offered by fans is that Caesar's score may be diminished by the brain tumor that afflicts him during the events of New Vegas, which is confirmed through interaction with the followers of the Apocalypse. But a simpler interpretation is that Obsidian simply gave Snuffles a generous intelligence value as a small act of affection for the character, without cross-referencing it against the game's political figures. Either way, the mole rat wins. This kind of playful imbalance in the game's underlying numbers reflects an honesty in how New Vegas was designed. The statistics that drive the world were not always polished to perfection or made to tell a consistent ideological story. Sometimes a mole rat in a quarry is smarter than a tyrant, and the game is entirely comfortable with that. Inside the King's School of Impersonation, in Freeside, a building occupied by a gang who revere the memory of an ancient musical icon, players who explore carefully enough will find an unusual item tucked inside one of the back rooms. Sitting on a table is a beer pong table, a piece of pre-war social life somehow surviving intact amid the neon decay of Freeside. Beside it rest 3 ping pong balls, items that exist nowhere else in the entire game. These balls have no function. They cannot be used in any recipe. They provide no statistical benefit. They cannot be thrown or incorporated into a weapon. They exist as junk, but a very specific, very rare variety of junk. The beer pong table itself is a similarly unique prop, something that belongs to a world where people gathered and played games and spent time together before the bombs changed what gathering meant. Seeing it inside a building dedicated to performance and impersonation gives it an accidental resonance, as if the king's followers kept it not just for nostalgia, but because some traditions refuse to be destroyed. The 3 ping pong balls became something of a collector's item within the Fallout New Vegas community precisely because of their uselessness. There is a particular category of player for whom rare items carry value independent of any mechanical purpose, the pure completionist, the dedicated archivist of the Wasteland. For that kind of player, the ping pong balls represent a small trophy, something to display in a storage container or carry as a symbol of thorough exploration. The fact that Obsidian placed them in a room inside a building with its own complex lore and quest line, without drawing any attention to them, is exactly the kind of creative generosity that defined New Vegas. The world was populated not just with the things you needed, but with the things that simply belonged there, waiting to be found by whoever was patient enough to look. Doc Mitchell's home in Good Springs is where every playthrough of Fallout New Vegas begins. You are carried there unconscious treated by a kind and quietly eccentric doctor, and guided through a tutorial framed as medical recovery. Most players follow the prompts dutifully. They answer Mitchell's questions, stare into the vigor tester, and complete the Rorschach ink blot portion of the process before walking out into the desert to begin the main story. But tucked beside the fireplace inside Mitchell's home, there is a Brahmin skull that hides one small cut interaction. If you walk toward the fireplace and use the grab command, pushing the appropriate button on consoles or pressing Z on personal computers, the game will prompt you to interact with the skull in a way that is not available through normal examination. This grab interaction was part of a cut tutorial section that was removed before release. The underlying code was left intact, meaning the prompt still appears, but the expected tutorial content that should follow it was never included in the final build. It is one of those vestigial remnants of development that tells a story about the process of making something large under time pressure. Someone built a Brahmin skull tutorial segment, placed the skull by the fire, wrote the code for triggering it, and then the segment was removed, but the skull and its trigger remained. Players who notice it are essentially finding a ghost of a game that almost was, an echo of content that vanished before shipping. Doc Mitchell is already one of the more textured, minor characters in New Vegas, his gentle humor and genuine care for the courier making the opening moments feel warmer than most apocalypse games manage. The hidden skull interaction adds another quiet layer to a room already full of small character details, as if the house itself remembers what it was supposed to teach you. The character known as Old Lady Gibson, found operating a salvage operation near the Gibson scrapyard south of New Vegas, is one of the many minor merchants the player encounters across the Mojave. She is weathered and direct, a scavenger of considerable experience who has spent her life gathering useful things from the wasteland's ruins. Among her collection, she mentions a particular favorite, a large letter O that she acquired from the RepCon test site. That detail alone might pass without consequence, but Fallout New Vegas is a game where the world is specific enough that you can walk to the RepCon test site and verify the claim. If you visit the facility and look at its exterior signage, the letter O is visibly absent. The gap in the sign is there, waiting to be noticed by any player who made the connection and took the walk. The O that Gibson sits on, that became her prized possession in the salvage trade, once spelled out a company name on a building miles away. This kind of environmental storytelling asks something small but meaningful of the player, a willingness to connect information across distances, to treat dialogue not as flavor text, but as a pointer towards something real within the world. Most games of this scale could not afford to build in the level of consistency required to make a prop's origin story verifiable at the source location. New Vegas built it anyway. Old Lady Gibson sells her wares, keeps her dogs close, and sits on a letter salvaged from a defunct aerospace company as if it were a throne. The world treats this as unremarkable, the ordinary outcome of survival and scavenging. But the player who walks between those 2 points carries a small, complete story, one told not through cutscene or narration, but through the quiet consistency of a world that remembered its own details. The quest called There Stands the Grass sends the player to Vault 22, a facility overtaken so thoroughly by plant life that the vegetation itself has become a form of architecture, roots threading through walls, green canopy pressing through ceilings, the vault's original purpose buried under decades of uncontrolled growth. Before entering, the player can learn about a scientist named Keeley who has been conducting research inside, and meeting Keeley reveals an important fact about how the vault became what it is. Spores in the air, Keeley explains, are responsible for the wild plant life that now surrounds the facility and spreads out into the nearby Mojave. These spores are not visible under normal conditions, but Keeley has access to an ultraviolet light on the vault's second level, and under that light, the spores become visible, drifting in slow clouds through the contaminated air. If the player helps Keeley complete her work and purge the spore source, something small and satisfying happens. Returning to the UV light reveals that the spores are no longer visible. They are gone. The air has changed. This detail asks for very little from the player, but offers a kind of quiet resolution that most games would never bother to provide. The world of New Vegas acknowledged the change you made and reflected it not with a dramatic transformation of the landscape, but with an absence, a negative space where something harmful used to float. The vault's air is cleaner now, and you can see the proof if you hold a light up to it. It is the kind of scientific cause and effect storytelling that made Vault 22 feel like a real place, rather than a level designed around a single quest. The spores had a source, and the source could be addressed, and the evidence of that was visible in the world if you knew where to look. Quiet, precise, entirely unrewarded beyond the satisfaction of noticing. Just southeast of Horowitz Farmstead, positioned off the main paths that most players travel when navigating the Mojave, there is a house that behaves differently from almost every other fully interior structure in the game. Most buildings in Fallout New Vegas require a loading screen to enter. You interact with the door, a brief transition occurs, and you find yourself inside a separate cell of the game world. This house is different. It is open in the strictest technical sense, meaning you can walk through its door without any transition, any pause, any separation between the inside and outside of the structure. The house is complete. It has furniture, it has the shape of a home rather than a shell, and it is guarded by two fiends who will need to be dealt with before the space becomes comfortable. But beyond the practical matters of occupancy, the house represents a technical distinction that players who have spent significant time in the Mojave have noted as unusual. Among fully built interior structures in the game, this may be the only one that operates this way, existing as a single continuous space rather than a separate loaded cell. Whether this was intentional or a result of how the house's geometry was constructed within the game engine is unclear. The distinction carries no narrative weight, no quest implications, no reward for noticing it. It is simply a house that works differently out on the edge of the map, guarded by people who have no idea they are sitting inside a small technical curiosity. Fallout New Vegas is built on the same engine as its predecessors, an engine with particular rules about how the world is divided and loaded. Finding a structure that appears to break those rules, even in a small and unremarkable way, is the kind of discovery that feels like finding a door left open in a very large building. You did not know you were looking for it, but once you find it, you cannot quite forget it is there. The Sunset Sarsaparilla Company is one of the great commercial ghosts of the Mojave Wasteland, a pre-war soft drink manufacturer whose blue bottles and distinctive star-shaped bottle caps became a kind of currency and mythology long after the company ceased to exist. Drinking Sunset Sarsaparilla restores health and adds a small amount of radiation, as might be expected from a beverage that has been sitting in glass bottles for 2 centuries. But the bottle caps themselves carry a deeper story, one that the game reveals only to players who pursue a relatively obscure questline. The Sunset Sarsaparilla Company ran a promotional campaign before the war that involved special star-shaped bottle caps, different from the standard variety, which could be redeemed for prizes at the company headquarters. A man in the game's world named Festus, a robotic mascot installed at the company's headquarters in the Mojave, still honors this promotion, despite the small logistical difficulty that both the company and its prize fulfillment infrastructure were destroyed by nuclear fire. Players who collect 100 Sunset Sarsaparilla star caps and bring them to Festus will be rewarded, though the nature of that reward is perhaps the finest example of the game's sense of humor about hope and the passage of time. The prize waiting for the collector after 2 centuries of promotional validity is something that no longer has any practical use, something that made sense in the world that built the promotion and means something entirely different now. The machinery of commerce persisted long after the meaning behind it faded, still dispensing its final offer to anyone patient enough to claim it. The Sunset Sarsaparilla questline is called The Legend of the Star, and it is entirely optional, easily missed, and requires a kind of quiet dedication, the accumulation of something small and strange over a long period of wandering. It is a perfect Fallout New Vegas quest, built around a commercial ghost that still believes in itself. The Lucky 38 Casino stands at the northern end of the New Vegas Strip, a towering pre-war structure closed to the public for decades before the events of the game. Its upper floors serve as the home and fortress of Robert Edwin House, one of the game's primary power figures, a man who survived the bombs through a combination of extraordinary preparation and a sophisticated life support system that preserved him in a state of suspended consciousness. The Lucky 38 is House's monument and his prison, and it contains numerous details most players never investigate closely. The casino floor of the Lucky 38 is fully decorated with slot machines, tables, and the architecture of a working gambling establishment. But the slot machines on the floor are non-functional. They cannot be played. They stand as furniture in a space that has not welcomed a genuine customer since before the war, preserved as if waiting for a clientele that will never return. House maintains the exterior lights of the Lucky 38, keeping it visible across the strip, but the inside remains frozen, a museum of a future that arrived too early and then was abandoned. What makes this detail notable is the way the game uses it to characterize House's relationship to time. He did not gut the casino to make it more functional as a residence. He preserved it, lights and tables, and non-working slot machines, as if the structure's commercial purpose still mattered to him on some level, even after centuries. The Lucky 38 is both his home and the evidence of what he was working toward before the war interrupted everything. Some players spend time in the casino's cocktail lounge, which contains functional lighting, a bar, and a sense of suspended social life. Victor the Securitron tends the space as a kind of caretaker, and the room feels as if it expects guests who are 200 years overdue. That quality of expectation, spaces designed for people who no longer exist, runs through the Lucky 38 like a quiet current. Among the many merchant characters scattered across the Mojave, the gunrunners occupy a particular place in the game's economy and mythology. They are a weapons manufacturer and seller operating from a heavily fortified position southeast of New Vegas, behind a chain-link fence and guarded wall that ordinary visitors cannot pass. The actual smithing and fabrication happens inside the compound, and what gets produced comes out through a single vendor, the Vendortron, a Securitron terminal that conducts transactions from behind a protected barrier. The gunrunners in Fallout New Vegas are a continuation of a faction that first appeared in the original Fallout, where they operated out of the Los Angeles Boneyard. Their presence in the Mojave represents decades of organizational survival, an arms manufacturer that outlasted the war, outlasted the chaos that followed, and built a sustainable business model around the wasteland's permanent need for functional weapons. They do not take political sides, and they will sell to anyone with sufficient caps, regardless of faction affiliation. The Vendortron's placement behind protective barriers reflects the gunrunners' operating philosophy precisely. They are in the business of arming everyone else, which means they have thought carefully about what that implies for their own security. The compound design suggests that its architects understood the irony of being weapons dealers in a world where weapons are the primary tool of interaction. Every sale potentially funds your own eventual threat. Their product line changes with downloadable content that expanded the game's weapon selection, and the Gunrunner's arsenal is one of the most comprehensive weapon packs added to any Fallout game. But in the base experience, visiting the Vendortron at the right time with enough caps is simply one of the most reliable ways to equip yourself for the long Mojave ahead. The NCR Ranger Combat Armor, sometimes called the Desert Ranger Armor, is visually one of the most iconic pieces of equipment in Fallout New Vegas, combining a long coat with a reinforced chest plate and a distinctive gas mask helmet with glowing red eyes in the lenses. The image became representative of the game itself, used in promotional materials, and widely recognized as a symbol of the new California Republic's military presence in the Mojave. The armor's design draws deliberately from classic Western film imagery. The lone figure in a long coat standing against an open landscape, translated into a post-apocalyptic register. What is less frequently discussed is that the Desert Ranger armor carried by certain veterans in the game has a specific historical association within the lore. The Desert Rangers were an independent organization operating in the Southwest before eventually aligning with the NCR, and their combat armor predates the NCR Ranger program that inherited it. Players who pursue the quest that awards the full armor will find that it carries a sense of history beyond its statistical values, a garment that has meant something to more than one generation of people trying to keep order in a lawless desert. Equipping it changes how some characters respond to you, a small but meaningful acknowledgement from the game that certain pieces of equipment carry social weight. An NCR trooper recognizes the armor as something significant, and that recognition is built into the dialogue rather than simply assumed. The armor is not just protective, it is communicative, a statement about who you are or who you are trying to be. The gas mask design is practical within the lore, suited for environments with poor air quality, but it also creates a kind of visual mystery, a face that cannot be read, intentions that must be inferred from behavior rather than expression. It is a fitting design for a character class built around navigating a world of ambiguous loyalties. Goodsprings is the smallest and most peaceful town in Fallout New Vegas, a cluster of dusty buildings around a general store and saloon, home to a small community of settlers who are trying very quietly to be left alone. It is the place where the courier begins the game, recovered by Doc Mitchell and sent out into a desert full of consequences. Most players leave Goodsprings early and rarely return, the town serving primarily as a tutorial space and a setting for the game's opening questline. But Goodsprings has details that reward the player who lingers. The general store run by Chet contains items behind the counter that the player cannot access under normal circumstances, including a pre-war hat that requires either a speech check or the right faction reputation to negotiate loose. The saloon kept by Trudy has a functional radio and a pool table, and the game's pool balls face the texture resolution limitation noted in other discussions. From certain angles and distances, they appear numbered, but the model quality means they are essentially identical up close. The Goodsprings source, the water supply for the community, is located nearby and plays a small role in understanding the town's geography and survival. Towns in the Mojave do not simply exist. They persist because of specific resources, water and shelter, and proximity to trade routes, and Goodsprings illustrates that logic quietly without making it a lecture. You can understand why people live here if you look at what is around them. The cemetery on the edge of town, where the game begins with your character being buried, is one of the more thoughtfully designed opening locations in the series. The graves are marked and individual, suggesting a community that has had time to organize its grief. The grave you emerged from is just one more entry in a record of those the desert has taken, except that yours didn't hold. The Boomers are one of New Vegas's most distinct minor factions, a community of artillery enthusiasts living at Nellis Air Force Base, northeast of the city, descended from a group of vault dwellers who emerged from their shelter and responded to the hostile wasteland by developing an extreme philosophy of self-sufficiency and an extreme attachment to explosive weapons. They are not evil, not predatory, not particularly interested in the larger political conflict between the NCR and Caesar's Legion. They simply wish to be left alone, and they enforce that wish with howitzers. Reaching Nellis without being destroyed by artillery fire requires careful navigation and specific knowledge of the fire suppression patterns, and most players invest significant effort in running the gauntlet before establishing contact with the community. Once inside, the Boomers reveal themselves to be an oddly domestic society. Farmers, museum curators, historians, and artillerymen who have built a self-contained world behind their perimeter. Pearl, their elder, is thoughtful and measured. The community maintains a museum dedicated to pre-war aviation history, lovingly preserved by a woman named Loyal, who clearly has significant technical expertise. That museum is one of the quieter places in New Vegas, filled with models and photographs and the kind of careful documentation that speaks to people who believe history matters. The Boomers, so for all their noise, are at their core a community that remembers. They remember where they came from. They maintain the aircraft in their hangar. They teach their children about a world that ended before any of them were born. The B-29 bomber resting at the bottom of Lake Mead, accessible through an underwater quest involving the Boomers, connects to their deep reverence for aviation and their desire to restore something magnificent. That a functioning bomber could be raised from the bottom of a lake and returned to the sky is the kind of story that the Mojave tells when it is feeling generous. The followers of the apocalypse are one of the most intellectually defined factions in Fallout New Vegas, a group of scholars, doctors, and researchers whose fundamental commitment is to the preservation and distribution of knowledge in the service of rebuilding civilization from the ground up. They operate a free clinic on the outskirts of Freeside and have members scattered across the Mojave, each pursuing some dimension of their mission to heal, teach, and document. What makes them particularly interesting in the context of New Vegas's political structure is that they resist easy alignment. The NCR tolerates them but does not absorb them. Caesar's Legion views them as subversive. The independent path of New Vegas does not automatically include them. They exist outside the game's central power struggle by choice, committed to a mission that transcends political outcomes. Their argument, voiced most clearly by a physician named Julie Farkas, is that any civilization built on oppression or exploitation will eventually collapse the same way the old world did, and that the followers' role is to build the knowledge infrastructure that survives whatever collapses. The free clinic they operate in Freeside is a detail that grounds this philosophy in something practical. They are not only theorists, they are doing the work, treating patients who cannot afford care elsewhere, operating in a part of the city that the Strip ignores. That commitment to the unglamorous work of healing is part of what makes the followers feel real rather than merely ideologically interesting. Their medical expertise is also central to several quests, including the investigation of the experimental drug program at the REPCON test site and the treatment of various afflictions throughout the Mojave. Knowledge, in the followers' understanding, is most valuable when it relieves suffering, and New Vegas offers them abundant opportunity to test that commitment. The reputation system in Fallout New Vegas is one of the most developed faction mechanics in the series, tracking the player's standing with more than a dozen groups across the Mojave through a combination of karma-like binary evaluations and something more nuanced. Each major faction, the NCR, Caesar's Legion, the Kings, the Boomers, the Great Khans, Good Springs, and others, maintains its own independent record of your actions, and those records shape how the world responds to you in ways that go beyond simple hostility or friendship. One of the more interesting mechanical details is how faction disguises interact with this system. Wearing the armor of a faction whose members you have previously attacked does not simply erase the record of that hostility. Guards will become suspicious if your infamy level is too high, checking you more carefully than they would a genuine member. The game tracks your history and does not allow clothing to fully cover it if the underlying record is sufficiently damning. This creates interesting situations where a player who has played aggressively must navigate the world differently than one who has been careful. The Mojave does not forget, and neither do its inhabitants, even when they cannot immediately identify you. Your past follows you at a slight delay, filtered through the logic of how well word travels in a world without functioning telecommunications. The wild card reputation, being considered unpredictable by multiple factions simultaneously, is one of the more unusual states in the game, reflecting a particular kind of player behavior that the system was designed to acknowledge. Being trusted by no one and feared by all is its own form of influence in the Mojave, even if it closes certain doors permanently. Nipton is one of the most deliberately constructed pieces of environmental storytelling in Fallout New Vegas, a small town on the southern edge of the Mojave that players typically encounter early in the game after receiving their first major quest objective. Arriving in Nipton, the player finds bodies on crosses at the town's entrance, survivors in varying states of shock, and evidence of a recent lottery conducted by Caesar's Legion that distributed different fates to the town's residents based on drawn tickets. The lottery was not entirely random cruelty. Nipton had been collaborating with both the Legion and other parties in ways that ultimately made it useful to no one, and the Legion's response was to make an example of it, but one constructed with a perverse kind of logic. Some residents won immediate death, some won enslavement, some won severe physical punishment. One man won freedom. The randomness of which outcome fell to which person is presented as the Legion's dark imitation of the pre-war chance-based economy that once defined Las Vegas. Oliver Swanwick, the single Nipton resident who won the lottery's first prize and was released, can be found outside the town in a state of hysterical relief. He will sell you his lottery ticket for a small number of caps, certain that you will not believe him, but unable to contain his need to tell someone what happened. The ticket itself is a junk item. It cannot be used for anything. But holding it connects you physically to the thing that just happened in that town, a small material object from a large and dark event. The Legion soldier who presents Nipton as an object lesson in what Legion order looks like is Vulpes Inculta, one of the Legion's most disciplined officers, and his explanation is calm and almost academic. He is proud of the work. That composure in the face of what surrounds him is one of the game's most carefully designed pieces of characterization, a deliberate contrast between the chaos of the scene and the certainty of the man who made it. The casinos of the New Vegas Strip operate under a specific mechanic that most players discover organically, but few understand in its full technical detail. When a player gambles at the Atomic Wrangler, the Ultra Lux, or the Gomorrah, the casino tracks cumulative winnings, and once you reach a specific threshold of profit, you will be banned from the gambling tables. The ban is permanent for that playthrough. The casino will no longer allow you to sit at the games, though you may continue to use the rest of the establishment's services. Each casino has its own threshold for this ban, calibrated to reflect the establishment's financial posture. The Ultra Lux, home of the White Glove Society, has the highest threshold, reflecting a clientele that expects to lose significant sums before the house intervenes. The Atomic Wrangler, A rougher establishment catering to the less affluent visitors to Freeside has a much lower ceiling. The Gomorrah operates somewhere between the two, consistent with its position as a mid-tier strip establishment with complex internal politics. This mechanic is unusual in games that simulate gambling, which typically allow the player to win or lose without institutional consequence. New Vegas adds the dimension of institutional memory. The house tracks you, and when you become too successful, the house enforces its own survival. The ban is not hostile exactly, but it is final. You are no longer welcome to take the casino's money, though you are still welcome to spend your own. Players who reach the ban threshold at all three major casinos have effectively won a quiet victory against the establishments that run the Strip. The caps accumulated through successful gambling are rarely the point. It is the confirmation that you read the games correctly, understood the odds, and took enough that the house decided to protect itself from you. The White Glove Society is one of the most unsettling factions in Fallout New Vegas, occupying the ultra-luxe casino at the northern end of the Strip with an air of refined elegance that barely conceals something considerably darker. They are an exclusive social club dedicated to the cultivation of pre-war refinement, formal attire, elaborate meals, and a studied distance from the rougher realities of life outside their establishment. But the game's quest line involving them, called Beyond the Beef, eventually reveals that the Society's dining menu has occasionally included items that the membership's refined sensibilities would theoretically prohibit. The mystery is constructed carefully, beginning with a man searching for his missing nephew and expanding into a full investigation of the Society's kitchen, basement, and internal politics. The White Glove Society was not always this way. They adopted cannibalism as a cultural practice before being convinced by Mr. House to abandon it as the price of operating on the Strip. The questline suggests that the practice was not fully abandoned, that certain members maintained it quietly beneath the Society's polished surface. What makes the White Glove Society interesting beyond the horror of the central mystery is the way they embody a broader theme in New Vegas, the relationship between civilization and the behaviors that civilization defines as unacceptable. The Society is, by the Strip's standards, supremely civilized. They dress well, they speak carefully, they maintain an environment of genuine luxury. The thing they do in the basement contradicts everything the front of the building represents, and the game uses that contradiction to ask something about the conditions under which civilization's rules hold. The questline offers several resolution paths, including options that involve stopping the practice permanently, stopping only the immediate crime, or choosing not to interfere at all. Each outcome carries its own weight and its own consequences for what the White Glove Society becomes afterward. The Silver Rush Weapon Shop on the Strip's Freeside border, operated by the Van Graff family, is one of the more interesting commercial establishments in New Vegas from a purely mechanical standpoint. It sells energy weapons at prices that reflect their relative rarity in the Mojave, and it is staffed by Van Graff guards who take their security responsibilities extremely seriously. Any companion the player brings into the building must wait outside, and attempting to take weapons from the display cases without purchasing them will result in immediate and overwhelming hostility. The Van Graffs themselves are a wealthy merchant family with significant energy weapon interests throughout the Western Wasteland, and their presence in New Vegas represents both a commercial investment and a power play against the gunrunners. The questline involving them, Heartache by the Number, is one of the game's more morally complex side quests, involving a woman named Cass, whose caravan was destroyed by the Van Graffs to prevent competition, and who is seeking either justice or revenge, depending on your interpretation of what she needs. What the Silver Rush represents economically is a deliberate alternative to the gunrunners. Where the gunrunners specialize in conventional ballistic weapons, the Silver Rush controls the energy weapon market, and the two establishments exist in an uneasy commercial relationship that reflects the broader factional tension of the Mojave. Even the weapons trade has its own politics in New Vegas, its own power structures and territorial conflicts. The plasma defenders, laser rifles, and tri-beam laser rifles available at the Silver Rush are weapons that many players will not have the appropriate ammunition or skills to use early in the game, making the shop feel like a promise for a later playthrough, a display of things you will eventually become capable of. The town of Prim lies along the main highway between Good Springs and Boulder City, a small community centered around a casino complex that has been taken over by escaped convicts from the nearby Mojave Outpost prison. Liberating Prim is an early player-driven task in the game, but what makes the settlement interesting is not the liberation itself, but what the game requires you to do afterward. Choose a sheriff. The options for Prim's new sheriff are specific and varied. You can convince an NCR officer named Myers, currently imprisoned, to take the job if you negotiate his pardon. You can reinstall the Vicky and Vance Casino's Prim Slim robot as the town's law enforcement, programming him for the role. Or you can leave the town without a sheriff, a choice that is available and has its own downstream effects. Each choice carries a different kind of authority. A human with a record but genuine experience, a machine with total commitment but no adaptability, or the absence of structure entirely. The game does not editorialize strongly about which is correct, allowing the outcomes to speak for themselves over time. Prim's fate after your choice is reflected in small ways as the game continues: population stability, merchant presence, the presence or absence of trouble. This delegation of civic decision-making to the player is one of the ways New Vegas makes its world feel inhabited by consequence. Prim is a small town, and its sheriff problem is a small problem in the context of Hoover Dam and the fate of the Mojave. But the game takes it seriously, as if every town deserves to have its future considered carefully. Among the many ambient details embedded in New Vegas's audio design, one of the more specific and rarely discussed involves the theme music that plays in different regions of the Mojave. The game's soundtrack was composed by Enon Zur, who also provided music for Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, and his ambient pieces for New Vegas carry regional variations that correspond loosely to the cultural territory of each area. The Mojave itself has a dry, open quality to its ambient tracks, reflecting the landscape's emptiness and scale. But entering NCR territory, around Camp McCarran, the NCR sharecropper farms, or the areas around Boulder City, introduces subtle musical characteristics that feel more organized, more institutional, as if the presence of the NCR's military and administrative structure is audible in the air itself. Areas associated with Caesar's Legion have a darker, more rigid tonal character. These shifts are not dramatic. They do not announce themselves with fanfare or sharp transitions. They are more like the atmospheric change you feel crossing from one kind of geography into another, a slow alteration in the quality of the sound that surrounds you. Players who complete multiple playthroughs sometimes report noticing these regional characteristics as a kind of emotional shorthand. The music is telling you where you are in the world's political geography even before you see the flags. The ambient music of Freeside is perhaps the most distinctive, carrying a quality of hustle and edge and mild desperation that reflects the district's character precisely. The strip's music is louder, flashier, performative in the way that the strip itself is performative, a display designed to attract and retain attention. The Courier, the player character of Fallout New Vegas, is unusual among Fallout protagonists in having a specific professional identity that exists independent of player choice. You were a courier before the game began. You were employed by the Mojave Express to carry a package from Prim to New Vegas, a routine job that went catastrophically wrong when the parcel's recipient arranged to have you shot and buried in the desert outside Goodsprings. Everything that follows is the downstream consequence of a courier's assignment. This professional framing gives the courier a different quality from the lone wanderer of Fallout 3 or the sole survivor of Fallout 4, both of whom are defined primarily by loss and origin. The courier is defined by a job, which is to say by function and reliability, qualities associated with persistence rather than tragedy. Someone who carries things between difficult places is already someone who accepts risk as part of ordinary work, which grounds the courier's eventual navigation of the Mojave's most dangerous political terrain in something practical. The name Courier 6 implies the existence of at least 5 other couriers on the same route, all of whom declined the final delivery, a fact mentioned early in the game that adds a layer of accidental significance to your character's involvement. Others saw the risk and passed. You happened to take the job. That kind of contingency, becoming the center of a world-altering conflict because of professional availability on a particular day, is a very Fallout way to begin a story. The chip you were carrying, the platinum chip that Benny shot you over, is one of the most consequential small objects in the Wasteland's recent history. It contains upgrades to the Securitron network that could shift the balance of the entire Mojave. A courier was chosen to carry it because couriers do not ask about what is in the package. Boulder City sits at the edge of the Colorado River, a small NCR-controlled settlement built around the memory of the first battle of Hoover Dam, the conflict in which the NCR and Caesar's Legion first clashed over control of the dam and the river it manages. A monument in the center of town commemorates the NCR soldiers who died in that battle, and the settlement carries a quality of military sobriety that distinguishes it from the commercial energy of the Strip or the agricultural pragmatism of the sharecropper farms. The ruins on the outskirts of Boulder City conceal a quest line involving the Great Khans, a raider gang that has been sheltering in the destroyed area following a betrayal by the Powder Gangers during the same battle the monument commemorates. The questline, which asks the player to negotiate between the NCR's desire for prisoners and the Great Khan's desire for safe passage, is one of the game's quieter moral calculations. No side is entirely sympathetic. No outcome is entirely clean. What Boulder City does beautifully as a location is hold the weight of history without being defined solely by it. The monument is there. The evidence of old conflict is embedded in the architecture of the ruined areas, and the questline connects present-day decisions to a past engagement whose details are still contested. The NCR remembers the first battle one way. The Great Khans remember it another. Both versions contain truth. The dam itself is visible from Boulder City's position near the river, a constant presence on the horizon that reminds every character and player in that area what all of this is ultimately about. Hoover Dam is not just infrastructure in New Vegas, it is the argument. Everything else in the Mojave is negotiable, but whoever controls the dam controls the water and the power, and that is not negotiable. The Gomorrah Casino on the New Vegas Strip is the most openly decadent of the major establishments, operating with significantly fewer pretensions than the Ultra Luxe and significantly more variety in its offerings than the Atomic Wrangler. It is owned and operated by the Omertas, a powerful and secretive criminal family whose compliance with Mr. House's strip agreements is more performative than genuine. The questline centered on the Gomorrah and the Omertas, called How Little We Know, involves uncovering a plot that the family has been cultivating against the strip's power structure. The Gomorrah's interior is detailed in ways that reflect Obsidian's interest in depicting vice without glorifying it. The establishment's various services are available to the player in limited and carefully mediated ways, and the people who work there are characterized as individuals with their own circumstances, rather than simply as props in a red light district. Several of the Gamora's employees have quests associated with them, including a dancer named Joanna, whose situation connects to the Omerta's broader operations. The Omerta family itself is one of New Vegas's more interesting minor power groups, not because they are particularly sympathetic or ideologically distinct, but because they represent a faction that is cooperating with the Strip's power structure purely out of calculation, waiting for the right moment to defect. Their loyalty to House is entirely transactional, and the quest line reveals the specific transaction they have been pursuing. That kind of transactional loyalty, maintained only as long as it serves a specific purpose, runs through almost every relationship in New Vegas. The game is deeply interested in the conditions under which cooperation holds and the conditions under which it dissolves. The Rex quest line in Fallout New Vegas is one of the more emotionally resonant companion stories in the game, built around a cyber dog who has been the companion of the king, leader of the King's Gang in Freeside for years. Rex's brain is deteriorating, and the king sends him with the courier in hopes that someone will find a way to repair the damage. The quest eventually leads to Old World Blues content, but in the base game, it requires finding a replacement brain from one of several sources, each with different consequences for Rex's personality. Rex himself is an old model robotic dog from before the war, predating even standard pre-war technology in certain respects. He was a police dog in his original function, trained to serve law enforcement, and his loyalty to the king reflects that foundational programming translated into a post-war context. The king's attachment to Rex is one of the warmer relationships in a game full of complicated ones. A simple story about a person and their dog set against a backdrop of gang politics and faction conflict. The choice of which brain Rex receives affects his behavior in small but noticeable ways. Different source brains give him slightly different movement patterns and responses, subtle enough that casual players might miss them entirely. It is another example of how New Vegas built consequences into choices that had no mechanical requirement to include them, adding texture purely for the sake of believability. Rex, as a companion, has lower carrying capacity than most others, and a combat style built around rushing enemies, which makes him vulnerable in ways that add stakes to bringing him into dangerous areas. The courier learns to care about Rex's safety, not through cutscene or narration, but through repeated experience of managing those vulnerabilities. The Prim Slim robot installed in the Vicky and Vance Casino in Prim is named for the casino's central attraction, the preserved car from the real-world criminal couple whose story was an inspiration for the pre-war fascination with romantic outlaws. The Vicky and Vance Casino is themed entirely around this couple, displaying the car in which they were killed and maintaining a gift shop stocked with memorabilia. The attraction itself is a commentary on how pre-war culture processed certain kinds of violence, romantic criminality, the appeal of people who lived outside the law and died for it. In the Wasteland, where violence is omnipresent and unglamorous, the preserved car and its tourist infrastructure feels like a relic from a world that could afford to aestheticize danger because it was not yet surrounded by it. The tourists who would have visited Prim are gone. The car and the gift shop and the robotic guide remain. Prim Slim himself has a full range of programmed enthusiasm for the attraction, delivering guided tour commentary about the car and the couple with the cheerful consistency of a robot who has never been told that the audience has changed and the world has ended. That consistency is both amusing and quietly melancholy, a machine maintaining a performance for a show that no one will ever see in the way it was designed to be seen. If you choose to make Prim Slim the town's sheriff, he applies that same consistent enthusiasm to law enforcement, which creates its own kind of local governance. Total reliability, zero adaptability. Whether that constitutes justice in the Mojave is a question the game leaves entirely open. The Lonesome Road downloadable content for Fallout New Vegas ends the story of the courier in a way that circles back to the beginning, revealing that the protagonist's history in the Mojave predates the opening scene in a way that most players did not expect. A figure named Ulysses, a former courier who was supposed to carry the platinum chip before the courier took the job, has spent years blaming the courier for a catastrophe that resulted indirectly from a delivery made long before the events of the main game. The revelation that the courier's previous work, before the story began, before Benny, before Goodsprings, had consequences that survived and grew into something devastating is one of the most elegant structural choices in the game's narrative. The courier did not choose to be at the center of the Mojave's conflict any more than they chose to be shot. They were there because of a series of professional decisions made in good faith, and the consequences of those decisions are still unfolding. Ulysses is one of the game's most carefully written characters, articulate, grieving, convinced of a particular historical interpretation that the player can contest through dialogue. The conversations with him are some of the longest and most substantive in a game full of substantive dialogue, demanding that the player engage with ideas about legacy, responsibility, and the meaning of work in a world where everything is contingent. The Divide, the setting of Lonesome Road, is a wasteland even by Mojave standards, a corridor of devastation marked by constant wind, falling rockets, and the ruins of a community that once existed. Walking through it with Ulysses' recorded messages playing in the background is one of the most cinematic experiences in the entire game, a long walk through someone else's grief toward a conversation neither party can avoid. The Sunset Sarsaparilla headquarters is a building most players visit for the quest line involving the star bottle caps, but it contains details that exist entirely outside that quest. The building's lobby preserves the pre-war commercial aesthetic of the Sunset Sarsaparilla Company. Promotional materials, product displays, vintage signage, the full visual vocabulary of a company that was successfully selling nostalgia before the war made everything nostalgic. The Festus robot who manages the headquarters operates with genuine company enthusiasm despite 2 centuries of vacancy, greeting visitors as potential customers and managing the star cap redemption with all the procedural care his programming allows. The company's promotional mascot has outlasted every human employee, every executive, every shareholder, and now tends an empty building to an audience of 1. The headquarters also contains storage areas with product inventory that never shipped, bottles of Sunset Sarsaparilla arranged on shelves as they were when the bombs fell. The product survived, the market did not. The result is a warehouse full of soda that waited 200 years to be consumed, now worth whatever a wanderer with a bottle cap economy decides it is worth. There is something in the Sunset Sarsaparilla Company's post-war existence, the robot mascot, the preserved bottles, the still-running promotional campaign that captures something essential about the way New Vegas handles its pre-war world. The institutions of the old civilization did not all disappear. Some of them persisted, running their protocols in empty buildings, maintaining brand loyalty to a customer base that no longer existed, continuing to function precisely because function was what they were built to do. The courier's companions in Fallout New Vegas are among the most developed in the series, each carrying extensive quest lines, substantial amounts of unique dialogue, and genuine character arcs that respond to the courier's choices over the course of the game. The game tracks not only the player's faction relationships, but also the specific companion's approval of your behavior. Certain actions will cause companions to comment, argue, or in extreme cases, leave entirely. Veronica Santangelo, a Brotherhood of Steel scribe encountered at the 188 Trading Post, has one of the most fully realized companion arcs in the game. Her questline deals directly with her internal conflict about the Brotherhood's increasingly isolationist direction, and the resolution of that questline depends on choices the player makes about how to handle the faction's internal politics. She is thoughtful, sometimes darkly funny, and genuinely attached to an institution she has begun to doubt. Rahul Tejada, a ghoul mechanic found imprisoned in Black Mountain, has the oldest backstory of any companion in the game. His memories extend back to the pre-war period, making him a direct living connection to the world that existed before the bombs. His optional quest involves deciding what kind of person he should be after centuries of survival, and the answer the player chooses reflects something about what kind of future the Mojave deserves. Each companion carries the game's central questions about loyalty, about the value of institutions, about what survives and what should, in miniature. The Courier's Party, assembled from the Mojave's various communities and backgrounds, becomes a portable version of the debate that the full game conducts at scale. The Dead Wind Cavern in the southern Mojave is one of the most densely populated locations with deathclaws in the entire game. A cave system housing a significant number of the apex predators of the wasteland, including a legendary variant that many players identify as one of the game's most challenging optional encounters. Most players either avoid Deadwind Cavern entirely or approach it with maximum preparation as a late-game challenge. The Deathclaw, as a creature in Fallout lore, is a chameleon that was genetically modified and released into the wild before the war, its natural camouflage abilities suppressed by the modifications, but its physical capabilities massively enhanced. The creature became the dominant large predator across most of North America's wasteland regions, adapting to different environments and developing regional variants across the series. In New Vegas specifically, the Deathclaw population in the Quarry Junction area, northwest of Good Springs, creates one of the most notable early-game obstacles, a direct path between important locations that is essentially impassable at low character levels. The Quarry Junction Deathclaws killed many players who attempted to rush through the main quest too quickly, and their presence there is a deliberate design choice, a spatial argument about the Mojave's danger level that the early game makes with considerable conviction. The ecological relationship between Deathclaws and the rest of the wasteland's fauna is one of those background details that New Vegas never directly lectures about, but depicts consistently. They are at the top of every food chain in every environment they inhabit, and the Mojave's other creatures, red scorpions, geckos, coyotes, operate in spaces the Deathclaws have not claimed. The 200-year-old world of Fallout New Vegas contains newspapers, holotapes, and terminal entries scattered throughout its environments that tell the story of the months and weeks before the Great War in fragments and implications. In Prim, in the NCR Correctional Facility, in the various pre-war buildings that dot the highway between Good Springs and Boulder City, these fragments collectively sketch a portrait of a civilization that knew something was wrong but could not quite agree on what to do about it. The newspapers reference resource wars, international tensions, and the kind of bureaucratic normalcy that persists even when existential crisis is visible on the horizon. Prices, entertainment, sports results, the ordinary texture of daily life continuing, even as the world moved toward destruction. There is something in reading those items in the context of 2 centuries of aftermath that makes the contrast particularly clear. Terminal entries in corporate offices and government facilities tell a different story, measured and professional, often revealing the specific decisions that shaped what came after. Vault Tech communications, found throughout the series, including in New Vegas, document the company's awareness that the vaults were experimental rather than purely protective, the careful institutional language that surrounded an extraordinary act of human experimentation. The holotape recordings carry the most personal weight, voices attached to specific moments, specific people, specific fears. Finding a holotape left by someone who did not survive and hearing what they chose to record in the time they had is one of the consistent, emotional experiences of the Fallout series, and New Vegas populates its world with them as densely as any entry in the franchise. The Mr. House questline in Fallout New Vegas is built around a character who represents one of the most unusual forms of survival in the series. A man who anticipated the apocalypse with sufficient precision and preparation to survive it in a state of suspended consciousness inside a life support system, emerging 2 centuries later to find that his preparatory work, including the missile defense array that protected New Vegas from nuclear bombardment, had largely succeeded. House is brilliant, autocratic, contemptuous of the democratic process, and entirely convinced that his vision for the future is the correct one. His argument that the NCR's democracy is too inefficient to rebuild civilization and that the Legion's totalitarianism is too brutal to sustain one is presented with enough clarity and confidence that many players find it genuinely persuasive. His alternative, a corporate technocracy run by himself from a suite in the Lucky 38, is either the Mojave's best chance or its most dangerous option, depending on how you weigh the variables. The personal history House reveals through conversation and terminal entries is one of the game's richest character studies. A pre-war billionaire who used his fortune and intellect to position himself as the sole reliable arbiter of the future, and who has spent 2 centuries refining a plan that depends on his own continued survival as its central condition. Everything House has built is contingent on House. That contingency is the game's implicit critique of his vision. The Lucky 38 is a monument, but it is also a single point of failure. A civilization built around one person's continued existence is a civilization that can end with that person. The Kings are one of the most charming minor factions in Fallout New Vegas, a gang in Freeside whose entire identity is built around impersonating an ancient pre-war musical icon, a style they absorbed from the recordings and films preserved in the building they occupy. The King himself, their leader, is calm and measured in a way that distinguishes him from most gang leaders in the game, and his relationship with the NCR refugees flooding into Freeside forms the basis of a quest line that deals with displacement, dignity, and the limits of hospitality. The building the Kings occupy, a pre-war performance venue, still contains the recordings and equipment that defined their founder's style, and the gang's commitment to that aesthetic, the clothing, the mannerisms, the musical references, is presented not as parody, but as genuine cultural inheritance. They absorbed what they found and made it their own, which is exactly how culture works in the Wasteland, and exactly how it worked in the real world they are inadvertently honoring. Rex the Cyberdog was the King's companion before the Courier inherited him, and that transfer reflects something about the King's character. He understands that Rex needs more than he can provide, and he lets the dog go because letting go is sometimes the better form of loyalty. The questline involving the Kings and the NCR refugees, called GI Blues, asks the player to navigate between 2 groups who both have legitimate grievances in a district that does not have the resources to satisfy both. It is a smaller version of the same problem the entire game poses, competing legitimate claims on limited things, and the question of who gets to decide how they are allocated. Caesar's Legion, the faction occupying the eastern portion of the Mojave and pressing against Hoover Dam, is one of the most intellectually constructed antagonists in the Fallout series. a slave-holding military empire built on a deliberate recreation of Roman imperial structure, led by a man named Edward Sallow, who studied Roman history with the followers of the Apocalypse before applying that study to a project of violent political reconstruction across the Southwest. Caesar's academic background is the detail that makes the Legion unusual as a villain faction. He is not simply brutal. He is theoretically sophisticated about brutality, able to articulate arguments about why the old world's democratic liberalism failed and why his authoritarian alternative represents a more stable, long-term path. Players who pursue his dialogue fully will find a character who has clearly thought deeply about political history and who applies that thinking in service of a moral framework that the game takes seriously enough to argue against rather than simply dismissing. The Legion's camp on the eastern bank of the Colorado River is one of the game's most distinctive locations, organized, clean by wasteland standards, operating according to a strict internal hierarchy that produces functional order. The argument implicit in its design is the same one Caesar makes explicitly. That order, even brutal order, is better than the chaos it replaced. Legate Lanius, Caesar's top military commander, is presented as something closer to pure force, less philosophically developed than Caesar, more directly dangerous, the martial expression of the Legion's power stripped of most intellectual framing. The contrast between the two men reflects an internal tension in the Legion's identity that the game explores without resolving. The second battle of Hoover Dam, which serves as the game's climactic event, regardless of which faction the player has aligned with, is one of the most carefully set up conclusions in the series. The entire game is structured around it. Every faction questline, every reputation built, every resource secured either contributes to or detracts from your faction's position when the battle begins. The choices made throughout the Mojave aggregate into a military situation, and the battle's outcome reflects the quality of the work done beforehand. The dam itself is presented with considerable technical accuracy as an infrastructure of profound importance. Water distribution, power generation, and the control of a major river that multiple civilizations depend on. The NCR has been maintaining it. The Legion has been trying to take it, and the independent path of New Vegas requires defending it while keeping it out of both major factions' hands. Each outcome implies a different future for the water and power that the dam provides. The game does not show you that future directly. The ending slides describe it in summary, voiceover, and images accounting for each major faction and location and their trajectory following the battle's conclusion. The Mojave story does not end with the battle. It continues, shaped by what you did and who you helped and which communities you built relationships with. The slides compress years into minutes, sketching possible futures from the decisions made during your playthrough. This approach to endings, summarizing through slides rather than showing, is inherited from the earlier Fallout games and works particularly well in New Vegas, where the number of factions and locations that the player can have influenced is large enough that a conventional cinematic ending could not accommodate them all. The wasteland is too complex to end in a single scene. The chalk drawings and environmental art scattered throughout Fallout New Vegas's locations are one of the most overlooked categories of visual detail in the game. In the Good Springs schoolhouse, chalk marks on the blackboard include basic arithmetic problems and a few phrases that suggest the school was in use at some point after the war. Someone was still teaching here, long after the world that built the building had ended. Similar small marks of continued civilization appear throughout the game, campfire arrangements that suggest organized communal life rather than desperate individual survival, hand-lettered signs directing travelers toward water or warning them away from danger, the evidence of people making their environments legible to other people. These marks are not prominent enough to be flagged, as environmental storytelling by the game's design, but they accumulate into a portrait of a wasteland that is not simply destroyed, but in the slow process of rebuilding itself. The NCR's presence throughout the Mojave has left its own kind of marks: standardized signage, infrastructure maintenance, the bureaucratic texture of an organization that believes in paperwork and procedure. The contrast between the NCR's institutional marks and the improvised marks of individual survivors creates a legible map of where order has reached and where it has not. In the Mojave Outpost, where NCR soldiers wait and trade and process travelers, the combination of military standardization and individual personalization, photographs, names carved into wood, small decorations on equipment, creates the texture of a long-term deployment. These people have been here long enough to mark the place as theirs, even though it belongs to the Army. The three major endings available in Fallout New Vegas, NCR, Legion, House, and the Independent Wildcard Path, each represent a distinct vision of what the Mojave's political future should look like and what values should organize it. They are not simply different alliance choices, but different arguments about governance, civilization, and the relationship between order and freedom. The NCR ending represents democratic institutionalism, the belief that the old world's governmental structures, reformed and maintained, offer the most sustainable path to rebuilding civilization. The criticism embedded in the NCR questline is that democracy without resource constraint and military overextension eventually collapses under its own weight. The NCR is stretched thin across too much territory with too little support from the citizens it serves. The Legion ending represents the argument that order requires hierarchy and that hierarchy requires enforcement, the belief that civilization begins with discipline rather than freedom and works backward toward liberty only after stability is secured. The game's presentation of the Legion acknowledges this argument, even as it refuses to endorse it, allowing Caesar to be articulate while surrounding his articulation with its consequences. The House ending is the most unusual, a single man's vision for a technocratic future implemented through capital, intelligence, and the accumulated preparation of a century's work. It is the most optimistic about the capacity of individual genius and the most pessimistic about collective decision-making. Whether it constitutes a future worth having is the question the game leaves open with the most deliberate ambiguity. The quiet after the Mojave speaks for itself in ways that no single quest or dialogue or piece of lore quite captures on its own. Fallout New Vegas is a game built from accumulation, the accumulation of small choices, small observations, small discoveries, each one unremarkable in isolation but meaningful in combination. The flies around a body, the absent O in a highway sign, the alien standing peacefully in the desert because you were careful. These things do not change the fate of Hoover Dam. They change something smaller and perhaps more important: the feeling that the world you are walking through was made with care. The wasteland remembers everything. Every pre-war terminal still holds its records. Every holotape preserves its voice. Every building maintains the shape of the life that used to happen inside it. The Mojave did not forget the world that built it, even after 200 years, even under the weight of radiation and resource war and the endless political machinery grinding above Hoover Dam. The neon still flickers. The Brahmins still drift north without knowing why. Snuffles still sits at the quarry, quietly more intelligent than a tyrant. These are the useless facts, the ones that serve no quest objective, change no outcome, affect no ending slide. They exist because someone building a world cared about it enough to put them there, and they persist because a world without them would be thinner, less real, less alive. The Mojave is a hard place, and it is a complicated place, and it is a place that does not offer easy answers to any of the questions it raises about civilization and power and what humans owe each other in a world that has already been destroyed once. But it is also a place where a small smiley face was drawn inside the O of a neon sign, where a mole rat outscores an emperor, where ping pong balls survive in a building dedicated to impersonation, where a courier who just wanted to finish a job ended up holding the fate of a river. These small things are the most honest parts of the game, the moments where someone stopped calculating and just made something worth finding. The Great Khans are one of the most historically layered factions in Fallout New Vegas, a raider gang whose origins trace back through multiple predecessor groups to the earliest days of post-war California. In the events of the first Fallout, a gang called the Khans was active in the wasteland around Shady Sands. Their descendants reorganized, fractured, were nearly destroyed at Bitter Springs by the NCR in a military action that the game treats as deeply morally complicated and eventually settled in the Mojave, operating in the Red Rock Canyon area northwest of Las Vegas. The Bitter Springs Massacre, referenced in several conversations and holotapes, is one of the game's most significant background events, a military operation in which NCR soldiers opened fire on fleeing Khans, including non-combatants, an event that defines the NCR's relationship with the Khans and the specific bitterness that the game's title subtly references. A ranger named Hanlon, stationed at Camp Golf, carries the weight of that decision and will speak about it if the player presses carefully. That history makes the Great Khans one of the more interesting factions to align with or against during the main quest. They are not simply raiders. They are a group that has been repeatedly nearly destroyed and repeatedly rebuilt themselves, carrying a grievance against the NCR that the game acknowledges has legitimate foundation, even as it presents the Khans' own behavior as often destructive. Their questline asks whether a group like this can find a future that is not defined by what was done to them. Papa Khan, the faction's leader at the time of the game's events, is caught between his people's desire for revenge and the practical reality that the Legion's alliance offer is not a partnership, but an absorption. Resolving that tension in a way that allows the Great Khans to find their own path is one of the Mojave's quieter, but more resonant small victories. The Jacobstown settlement northwest of New Vegas is home to a community of super mutants living under the protection and guidance of a nightkin named Marcus, a character who first appeared in Fallout 2 as the sheriff of the Broken Hills settlement. Marcus's presence in New Vegas is one of those cross-game continuities that reward longtime series players, seeing a character who survived across decades and hundreds of miles carrying his own history into a new situation adds depth to both games. Super mutants in the Fallout universe are humans transformed by exposure to the forced evolutionary virus, and the nature of that transformation and its effect on intelligence varies depending on the specific strain and the source game. In New Vegas, the Jacobstown super mutants are functional, organized, and capable of complex social interaction, while acknowledging that their community faces challenges from both external hostility and internal psychological complications from their Nightkin residents. The Nightkin specifically suffer from schizophrenia induced by prolonged use of stealth boys, the cloaking devices they relied on during the Master's army decades earlier, and their condition creates practical management challenges for the Jacobstown community. The quest involving Jacobstown, called Guess Who I Saw Today, deals with this issue in a way that treats super mutant psychology as a legitimate medical question rather than simply a monster behavior. Marcus himself, sitting at the edge of the settlement with a view of the mountains, is one of the game's most patient characters, someone who has seen enough of history to know that most problems have no clean solutions, and who has accepted that truth without being broken by it. The REPCONN test site, located northwest of Boulder City, is the setting for the quest line Come Fly With Me, which involves a group of ghouls who have taken shelter in the facility and developed a plan to leave Earth entirely, to find a world without radiation or prejudice, to go beyond the reach of everything that destroyed the one they were on. They are the Bright Brotherhood, led by Jason Bright, and their plan depends on restoring the facility's rockets to working condition. The quest line is constructed with unusual gentleness for Fallout New Vegas, asking the player to navigate between the ghouls' genuine aspirations and the practical obstacles preventing their departure without forcing a violent resolution. The ghost people encountered in the basement, early introduction to the Sierra Madre aesthetic, the dead money would fully develop, add a layer of threat, but the central emotional content of the quest is the community's relationship to hope. Jason Bright believes in his mission with a spiritual intensity that the game treats with neither mockery nor full endorsement, allowing the player to engage with it on their own terms. His conviction that there is somewhere better to go, that the sky above the wasteland is not the ceiling of possibility, but a threshold, is the kind of faith that makes a certain kind of sense in a world that was destroyed by the things people believed in. If you help them successfully, the rockets launch, the ghouls depart. You watch them rise from the desert floor and disappear into the sky. The launch pad is empty afterward, and the desert does not change. But something went up, and that fact carries a particular kind of weight in a game that so often measures progress in terms of survival rather than aspiration. The Sierra Madre Casino, accessible through the Dead Money downloadable content, is one of the most oppressive and beautiful settings in any Fallout game. A pre-war luxury resort that never opened, preserved in a poisonous red cloud that kills anything unprotected and inhabited by spectral figures who cannot be destroyed by conventional means. It was the project of a man named Frederick Sinclair, built for a woman named Vera Keyes, and the story of what it became is told through environmental architecture and holotape fragments that require careful attention to assemble. The casino's design reflects a particular vision of pre-war elegance, translated into post-war horror, grand ballrooms, luxury suites, and the infrastructure of a celebration that never happened, now populated by ghost people in hazard suits who drift through the haze with unnerving patience. The vending machines scattered throughout the Sierra Madres operate on a currency called Sierra Madre chips, printed by the hundreds of thousands for a grand opening that never came. Frederick Sinclair designed the Sierra Madre's security systems to protect something he valued more than the casino itself, a bunker beneath the building intended as a personal shelter, stocked with resources sufficient to outlast the apocalypse, built for Vera Keyes, who he loved, and who is now a holographic ghost projected by the building's entertainment system. The story of the Sierra Madre is ultimately a story about a man who built a monument to a love that could not save either of them. The gala event that was supposed to open the casino was still being advertised in broadcasts that reached into the Mojave decades later, the casino's automated systems continuing to invite guests who would never arrive. Some did arrive, eventually, drawn by the broadcasts and trapped by the cloud, becoming the ghost people over years of isolation and exposure. The Divide, setting of the Lonesome Road downloadable content, was once a community established by couriers who knew the terrain of the Southwest better than anyone. It was a junction point, a place where routes crossed and people paused, and for a brief period it had the qualities of a real settlement, buildings, community, the beginning of something. The courier's previous delivery runs had passed through it, and by the time of Lonesome Road, those runs had contributed to what the Divide became. A nuclear payload, marked as an inactive warhead in transit, was delivered to the Divide in the course of ordinary courier work. The markings were wrong. The payload was not inactive. Its presence, combined with the divide's particular geological instability, triggered a series of explosions that destroyed the community and created the landscape of constant devastation and falling rockets that defines the setting of the downloadable content. Ulysses, who was living in the divide when this happened, survived. He saw the community destroyed, and he interpreted the event through the lens of his ideology about nations and symbols and what they mean when they are carried unknowingly by people who do not understand what they carry. His grievance against the courier is about responsibility without intention, the question of whether being the mechanism of a catastrophe makes you accountable for it, regardless of whether you knew what you were delivering. The divide itself is one of the most visually striking settings in the series, a fractured landscape where wind tears constantly through broken buildings, where rocket trails mark the sky, where the infrastructure of a destroyed community juts from the ground at impossible angles. It is beautiful and desolate in equal measure, a fitting location for the game's final personal reckoning. The old Mormon fort, which serves as the followers of the Apocalypse's base of operations in Freeside, is one of the oldest structures in New Vegas, a pre-war historical landmark preserved from before the Great War, which predates the war that devastated the rest of the Mojave by centuries. The fort existed as a historical site before the bombs fell, and it has served as the followers' free clinic in the centuries since. Inside the fort, Julie Farkas manages patient flow, resource allocation, and the ongoing tension between the followers' mission and the practical limitations of operating in one of New Vegas's most impoverished districts. Freeside's residents, unable to access the Strip's medical facilities, depend on the followers' clinic for basic health care, which creates a steady demand that the fort's resources struggle to meet. The structural detail that the fort is genuinely old, not just post-war old, but pre-war historical old, gives it a different quality than most New Vegas locations. It has survived longer than the civilization it currently exists within, outlasting the Old World by centuries and outlasting the New World's most recent war by decades. The walls of the old Mormon fort have seen more of history than almost any other structure in the game. That layered age makes it an appropriate home for the followers of the Apocalypse, whose fundamental project is the preservation and transmission of knowledge across catastrophe. The organization and the building share a commitment to outlasting the forces that would prefer everything forgotten. The concept of the GECK, the Garden of Eden Creation Kit, appears in New Vegas's lore primarily through its earlier usage in other regions, but its existence as a pre-war Vault-Tec product reflects something important about the ideological framework the old world brought into its apocalypse preparedness. The GECK was essentially a terraforming device designed to help vault dwellers rebuild habitable environments from scratch after emerging into a world stripped of its previous infrastructure. Vault-Tec's distribution of GECKs, selective and strategic rather than universal, reflected the same hierarchical logic that governed their vault experiments. Not every vault received one. The vaults that received functional GECKs were positioned to succeed in ways that vaults without them could not, creating conditions for certain groups to rebuild quickly, while others struggled. The GECK was a post-war advantage distributed pre-war according to criteria that were never made fully transparent to the vault's eventual inhabitants. Vault City, mentioned in the background lore of New Vegas as an example of what successful post-war reconstruction can look like, used its GECK effectively to establish one of the most technologically advanced communities in the Western Wasteland. The fact that Vault City became insular and authoritarian despite, or perhaps because of, its technological advantage is the particular lesson its story carries. The GECK represents one of the Fallout series' central ironies. The tools for rebuilding civilization were distributed by the same institution whose experiments helped shape what that civilization would look like after the rebuilding. The garden was designed before the apocalypse by the architects of the experiment. The companions of Fallout New Vegas are allowed to comment on locations as the player travels, offering observations about the places they pass through that reveal something about their own histories and perspectives. These comments are triggered by proximity to specific areas and require only that the companion be actively following you. Most players hear them without realizing they are accessing a layer of characterization that required significant additional writing. Veronica comments near Brotherhood locations with a quality of complicated homecoming. The tension between institutional loyalty and personal doubt is visible in how she describes the places where she grew up. Boone, the NCR sharpshooter companion, has location-specific responses near NCR installations and near Bitter Springs that reveal the specific contours of his grief and guilt. ED-E, the iBot companion, plays audio logs when specific conditions are met, fragments of its own history delivered without context or explanation. These location-triggered lines are among the most elegantly written in the game, precisely because they do not demand attention. They are offered as the world passes, as commentary from someone who is seeing things alongside you, rather than explaining things at you. The companions are witnesses to the player's journey, and their observations accumulate into a record of what the journey meant to them. Arcade Gannon, the follower's doctor who joins the player under specific dialogue conditions, has perhaps the most specific location responses. His background with the Enclave creates reactions near old Enclave sites that carry a different weight than anything the other companions bring to those locations. His history makes certain places mean something different, and the game uses that difference quietly. The Mojave Express delivery company that employed the courier before the events of the game has offices and personnel scattered across the Mojave, and speaking to the company's representatives reveals a picture of a logistics operation that somehow managed to build reliability into a region where reliability is nearly impossible. Couriers in the Mojave move through NCR territory, Raider territory, Legion territory, and independent settlements, carrying packages without asking about the contents, maintaining a professional neutrality that allows them to work across political boundaries that most people cannot cross. The organizational question of how the Mojave Express maintains that neutrality, how they convince the NCR not to conscript them, how they negotiate safe passage through Legion territory, how they keep raiders from finding their deliveries too consistently profitable to leave alone, is not addressed directly in the game. It exists in the background as one of those economic mysteries that the Wasteland's functioning requires, but rarely discusses. The Platinum Chips was the most significant delivery in the Mojave Express's recent operations, though no one at the company knew what it contained. It was simply a package, prioritized and secured to be carried from Prim to New Vegas by a courier willing to take the job. That a device capable of reshaping the Mojave's balance of power was traveling by the same system used to deliver shipments of medical supplies and personal letters is exactly the kind of mundane mechanism through which history operates. Courier 6 was not selected for any special quality of judgment or skill. There were other couriers available. The others declined a delivery that seemed unusually sensitive. The 6 accepted because accepting deliveries is what couriers do, and because something about the usual calculus of caution and professional responsibility came down slightly differently on that particular day. The radio stations available during play in Fallout New Vegas are one of the most underappreciated layers of world building the game offers. Radio New Vegas, hosted by Mr. New Vegas, voiced by the same actor who voiced the Vault Dweller's companion in earlier productions, delivers news updates that reflect the player's actions in the world, commenting on events that the courier has been directly involved in from the perspective of the Mojave's general public. Those updates create a feedback loop between the player's experience and the world's perception of it. You make a choice, and later, the radio reports on what you did, filtered through public interpretation and media framing. A diplomatic resolution that the player negotiated as a careful calculation becomes a news item that reduces it to its most legible elements. An action that felt morally complex in the moment becomes a headline. This dynamic is particularly effective because Mr. New Vegas's tone is consistent regardless of what the news contains. Smooth, pleasant, professionally upbeat in the manner of pre-war radio personalities, applying the same presentational style to reports of NCR military losses that it applies to entertainment announcements. The medium's cheerful surface creates a productive dissonance with whatever content it carries. Black Mountain Radio, the station run by Tabitha, the super mutant from her fortified position in the hills north of New Vegas, is one of the game's genuinely funny pieces of environmental character work. A paranoid broadcast full of anti-human propaganda and Tabitha's own idiosyncratic worldview, running on equipment that the player can eventually sabotage or not as the quest demands. New Vegas as a setting asks a specific question that the rest of the Fallout series tends to approach differently. Not just how do you survive after the end of the world, but how do you rebuild pleasure? Las Vegas before the war was an entertainment economy, a city built around the idea that people will spend money to experience joy and stimulation and the possibility of transformation through chance. New Vegas after the war is trying to answer the question of whether that model survives the apocalypse and what it looks like when it does. The Strip's functioning casinos represent one answer. Yes, pleasure survives, but it survives in a form controlled by powerful institutions, extracting value from people who come seeking it. The music and the lights and the tables are real, but they serve an economic and political logic that has nothing to do with joy. Mr. House maintained New Vegas because it was valuable infrastructure, not because he cares about people's happiness. The NCR wants to control the Strip because it generates resources, not because democracy requires entertainment. Freeside's scrappier, rougher version of entertainment, the Atomic Wrangler, the street performers, the informal economy of Freeside's main drag, represents another answer. Pleasure survives here too, but without institutional management, with all the disorder and risk that implies. The people who come to Freeside for a good time are not protected from consequences in the way that Strip visitors theoretically are. That contrast between managed pleasure and unmanaged pleasure, between the neon certainty of the Strip and the uncertain vitality of Freeside, is one of the game's most carefully drawn spatial arguments. You can read New Vegas's economic geography simply by walking east from the outer edge of Freeside through the Strip's checkpoints and noticing what changes. The desert at night in Fallout New Vegas is one of the game's most atmospheric conditions. The temperature drops, the ambient sound shifts, and the stars above the Mojave become visible in a way that the game's lighting engine handles with genuine care. Moving through the wasteland after dark changes the quality of exploration, making familiar routes feel different, making encounters with enemies feel more dangerous, and occasionally revealing details of the landscape that daylight obscures. Some of the game's more memorable moments happen at night specifically because the setting is designed to use darkness as an atmospheric tool. The neon of New Vegas is more vivid against a dark sky. The fires of distant camps are more visible. The world contracts around what the player can see, which focuses attention in ways that daytime exploration does not. The transition between day and night in New Vegas is governed by a 24-hour cycle that continues regardless of the player's actions, and time passes at an accelerated rate during travel using the Mojave's fast travel system or during sleep. Resting in a bed advances time in a way that restores health and sometimes triggers new events. Companions may comment on having slept nearby, merchants may have restocked, the radio may report new developments. Time in the Mojave is not simply a countdown to the battle at Hoover Dam. It is the medium through which the world breathes, the mechanism by which news travels and situations develop, and people who are waiting for something finally encounter it. The desert is patient in its rotation, indifferent to the urgency of the political machines running across its surface. The Atomic Wrangler Casino in Freeside is run by a pair of siblings named James and Francine Garrett, and their establishment occupies a particular niche in the New Vegas economy as the primary commercial hub for the portion of the population that cannot afford or access the Strip proper. The Wrangler offers gambling at lower stakes, a bar serving drinks at prices that Freeside residents can realistically pay, and a range of services that the Strip's more polished establishments do not advertise. It is a scruffier, louder, more honest version of what the Strip promises: pleasure without pretense, entertainment without the fiction that you are being treated as a valued guest. The Garrett twins themselves are interesting minor characters whose dialogue reveals a pragmatic understanding of Freeside's economics. They are not idealists. They are not particularly warm. They run a business in a difficult district, and they have thought carefully about what that requires. Their quest line, which involves finding specific employees to work at the Wrangler, introduces a cast of characters, each carrying their own situations and histories, hired to fill roles that the establishment needs filled, regardless of the complicated circumstances attached to the people filling them. The Wrangler's gambling tables operate under the same ban mechanics as the Strip casinos, but at a lower threshold. The house's resources are smaller, and its tolerance for loss correspondingly reduced. A player who wins consistently enough will be quietly escorted from the tables, the Freeside version of the same institutional self-protection that the Strip employs. The rules of commerce survive the apocalypse with remarkable consistency across economic classes. Sitting at the Atomic Wrangler's bar while the ambient sound of Freeside drifts through the walls is one of the game's quieter atmospheric experiences, a window into the lower tier of New Vegas's social structure, where people are having a genuinely good time with what they have, which is considerably less than what the Strip offers, but still considerably more than most of the Mojave. The Nellis Boomer children are one of the more thoughtfully depicted groups of young characters in the Fallout series. Growing up inside a heavily fortified airbase, surrounded by adults who respond to outsiders with artillery, the Boomer children nonetheless exhibit the full range of childhood curiosity and enthusiasm that any sheltered community would produce. They ask questions, they have opinions about the aircraft in the hangar, they view the adults around them as genuinely heroic rather than as ideologically extreme. One Boomer child in particular, a boy named Jack, has developed a fascination with the old world that goes beyond what his community formally teaches. He has spent time with the museum's materials and developed theories about pre-war aviation history that occasionally exceed what the adult Boomers know, asking questions that the adults cannot fully answer. His enthusiasm is portrayed without mockery. The game takes seriously that a child raised with access to specific historical materials would develop specific knowledge and enthusiasms. The Boomers' decision to raise their children within the base's perimeter is presented as the logical outcome of their founding philosophy, but the game gently raises the question of what those children actually know about the world outside. They have been told about outsiders. They have never met them under circumstances that did not involve incoming fire. The courier, who must run the artillery gauntlet to reach the base, is potentially the first genuine outside contact many boomer children have had. That dynamic, a child's curiosity meeting an outside world that has been entirely theorized and never directly experienced, is handled with the kind of care New Vegas brings to its minor characters. The boomers are not simply a faction to be unlocked for the ending. They are a community with its own internal culture, its own generational dynamics, its own version of the future that its children are being prepared to inhabit. The followers of the Apocalypse Doctor, named Arcade Gannon, carries a history that the game reveals slowly, and only if the player pursues specific conversational paths. He is the son of an Enclave officer, born after the events that destroyed the original Enclave base in California, and raised by former Enclave personnel who were trying to live quietly in a world that had every reason to hate them. His background is the reason he gravitates toward an organization defined by service rather than power. The followers offered him a framework for doing good that did not require resolving the complicated legacy of where he came from. Arcade's companion quest, I Could Make You Care, asks the player to take him to specific locations that trigger his memories and force him to confront the question of what his father's people left behind and what responsibility he carries for it. The locations are scattered across the Mojave in ways that require intentional travel, suggesting that the quest is designed for players who are already exploring thoroughly rather than rushing through the main story. The resolution of Arcade's quest involves a choice that reflects the broader themes of New Vegas, whether a person's history determines their possibilities, or whether those possibilities are defined by what they do with their present. The Enclave remnants who trained him can be mobilized in a specific way that the quest enables, and what becomes of that mobilization depends on decisions the player has already made about the shape of the Mojave's future. Arcade himself, in combat, prefers energy weapons, a preference that fits both his scientific background and his indirect connection to the Enclave's technology. He is quiet in the field, observant, occasionally dry in the way that someone carrying a complicated inner life tends to be. Traveling with him for long enough, you come to understand that he joined the followers not in spite of his history, but because of it, and that the understanding makes him a better doctor. The abandoned Brotherhood of Steel bunker, accessible in the Mojave, is one of the locations that connects New Vegas's present to the larger Brotherhood history playing out elsewhere in the Fallout timeline. The bunker was a field installation that the Brotherhood occupied and then vacated or lost during operations in the region, and the question of what happened there is answered partially through terminal entries and environmental evidence rather than direct narration. The Brotherhood's relationship to technology, their defining characteristic across the series, is visible in how the bunker was maintained and equipped. Every piece of technology they valued was cataloged, preserved, and integrated into operational infrastructure with a care that suggests their reverence was practical rather than merely ideological. The bunker's computers still run, their records still accessible, their operational logs still describing the daily work of a chapter that no longer operates from this location. The Mojave Brotherhood chapter, led by Elder McNamara at the Hidden Valley Bunker, is one of the more isolated Brotherhood communities in the series, hunkered down under lockdown protocols following a series of losses in the field, debating internally whether to continue hiding or to re-engage with the wasteland around them. The questline involving them, still in the dark, deals directly with this institutional paralysis and the question of what the Brotherhood is supposed to be doing in the Mojave. Veronica's companion questline intersects with the Mojave Brotherhood in ways that make the institutional debate personal. She grew up there, She cares about the people still inside, and she has her own vision of what the Brotherhood should become that the faction may or may not be capable of adopting. Her story is the human interior of a political argument that the main quest handles at a structural level. The reputation system's most nuanced expression in Fallout New Vegas may be the way it handles the town of Goodsprings, specifically. Early in the game, the main quest sends the player in pursuit of Benny through the Mojave, but a side quest line called Ghost Town Gunfight asks the player to defend Goodsprings against a powder ganger attack. Choosing to help the town means investing time and resources into training residents, setting up defenses, and ultimately fighting alongside people whose well-being has no direct bearing on the main story. The powder gangers who threaten Goodsprings are former prisoners from the NCR Correctional Facility who escaped during a riot, now operating as raiders across the southern Mojave. Their conflict with Goodsprings is small and local, a disagreement about a former member named Joe Cobb who wants the town's help, but it illustrates precisely the kind of immediate, unglamorous crisis that the Mojave is full of. There are no power structures involved, no faction politics, no implications for Hoover Dam, just a small town and a threat, and the question of whether a courier who just dug themselves out of a grave has time to care. If you help defend Goodsprings, the town's residents develop a visible warmth toward you that persists for the rest of the game. Chet, who initially refuses to sell supplies at cost, will reconsider his prices. Trudy, who runs the saloon, will offer better terms. The reputation is small and local and mechanically minor, but the emotional texture it creates, the sense that you did something for people simply because they needed it, is one of the game's quietest rewards. The alternative path, siding with the powder gangers against Goodsprings in exchange for early reputation with that faction, is available but requires actions that most players find difficult to justify toward a community that has been nothing but kind to them since they woke up wounded in Doc Mitchell's house. Raul Tejada, when not serving as the courier's companion, lives alone in a shack on the eastern edge of the map, far from the major settlements in a kind of deliberate geographic isolation. He has been alive for long enough to have experienced the full span of the post-war period, including memories of Mexico City before the bombs fell, and his age has given him a relationship to time that other characters in the game do not have. His companion quest, Old School Ghoul, is initiated by speaking to a character who knew Raul during a different period of his life, and it culminates in a conversation about what it means to choose a role and commit to it when you have been alive long enough to outlast every role you have ever chosen. The player is asked to help him decide whether to continue living as a drifter and mechanic or to return to the identity he held in a previous life. The gunslinger, the person who used skill in a specific kind of work as the organizing principle of their existence. The two resolution options for Raul's quest affect his combat behavior in small but specific ways, changing the perks he develops and the way he engages in fights. But more than the mechanical difference, the resolution affects how he speaks about himself afterward. His dialogue shifts depending on what he decided, and the version of Raul who chose to reclaim his old identity carries himself differently than the version who chose to let it go. Traveling with Raul through the Mojave with this in mind, knowing that the quiet ghoul mechanic fixing your equipment has been alive for 2 centuries and has made and Ra-made himself several times over, adds a layer to every location you visit together. He has seen more of this world than almost anyone, and he chose to spend some of that time fixing things and traveling with someone else, which is its own kind of answer to the question his quest asks. The Mojave Wasteland contains a number of unmarked locations that appear on no map and are referenced in no quest. existing purely as discoveries for players who walk the desert carefully and investigate what they find. Some of these are simple abandoned camps with a few items and a suggestion of former habitation. Others are more elaborate, scenes that tell short, complete stories through environmental composition without any accompanying dialogue or holotape to explain what happened. One such location involves the remains of what appears to have been a small traveling merchant operation, with a cart and a Brahmin skeleton and the scattered evidence of a camp that ended badly. There are no enemies present. There is nothing to fight and nothing particularly valuable to collect. The scene simply exists as a picture of something that happened in the desert, readable through the arrangement of objects if you are willing to read it. Another unmarked area near the edge of the map contains a small garden, clearly tended at some point in the recent past, with planted rows that have been watered and maintained, but now show signs of being abandoned. Something interrupted whoever was growing things here. The garden did not die immediately. There was ongoing care before the care stopped. The plants are somewhere between thriving and neglected, caught in the transition between a tended thing and a wild one. These unmarked locations are the Mojave at its most honest, a world full of stories that do not fit into quest frameworks, that existed before the courier arrived and will continue existing in some form after they leave. The desert is larger than any single playthrough can account for, and these small, unnamed scenes are the evidence of that. The Vault Tech representative, whose job it was to ensure that Vault 111 residents in the Commonwealth had their paperwork in order, was by the time of Fallout 4 still sitting in a chair inside the vault after 2 centuries, having been kept in suspended animation along with the residents he was processing and then never retrieved. His status as a non-vault resident who ended up trapped inside by circumstances beyond his control is one of those small institutional ironies that the series deploys quietly throughout its world. The equivalent figure in New Vegas's vault lore appears in various terminal records, the mid-level Vault Tech employee whose job involved logistics and paperwork and who understood enough about the company's actual operations to be uncomfortable with them, but not enough to be included in the decision-making that shaped what the vaults became. The terminals in various Mojave vaults contain records written by people who believed they were doing legitimate work, whose professional language carefully avoids the implications of what their careful work actually enabled. Vault 21 in New Vegas, located beneath the Strip and converted into a hotel by Mr. House after he won the vault's contents in a game of chance, carries its own history of institutional irony. The vault was built around gambling as its governing principle, disputes and resources allocated by games of chance, the social contract implemented through probability. House, whose pre-war fortune was built on technological prediction of probability, won everything they had by playing by their own rules so well that the rules could no longer contain him. The hotel that exists now in the former vault preserves something of the original aesthetic. The vault architecture is still visible beneath the hotel renovations. The gaming tables are still the mechanism of interaction. The irony of a vault built on gambling being absorbed into a casino district is available to anyone who looks at the building and its history at the same time. The various magazine collectibles scattered throughout Fallout New Vegas provide temporary statistical bonuses when read, and they are designed with enough care to reward players who notice the variety of pre-war periodical culture they represent. There are celebrity gossip magazines that boost speech skills, technical journals that enhance various craft-related statistics, fitness publications that offer physical bonuses, and strategy publications that temporarily sharpen tactical capabilities. The magazine titles themselves are written with the same retro-futurist sensibility that defines the game's entire pre-war aesthetic, names that sound immediately familiar as genre types, while including details that mark them as belonging to an alternate timeline. Lad's Life, Programmer's Digest, Meeting People, Milsurp Review. Each one is a recognizable category of pre-war periodical culture translated into the Fallout universe's particular brand of mid-century Americana pushed forward into nuclear anxiety. The fiction of a world where these magazines were being published right up until the day the bombs fell is part of what gives the Wasteland its specific quality of interrupted normalcy. Someone was writing celebrity profiles and fitness columns and technical analysis for an audience of readers who were, in the days before the war, presumably reading them over breakfast or during commutes or in waiting rooms. The magazines are the texture of ordinary life, frozen in the moment of its ending. Finding a specific magazine in a specific location, a celebrity gossip publication in a Freeside apartment, a technical journal in an abandoned laboratory, carries its own small narrative implication about who was living and working in that space and what they were interested in. The objects are not neutral. They are character evidence for people who are no longer present. The Cottonwood Cove location on the Colorado River is the primary Legion staging area on the western bank, the point where Caesar's forces maintain a crossing into the Mojave and from which patrols and raiding parties operate into NCR territory. It is a significant military installation in terms of the faction's strategy, but it is also a location that contains a number of environmental details about what daily life in the Legion looks like when it is not actively fighting. The slaves held at Cottonwood Cove represent one of the game's most direct depictions of what the Legion's social system means in human terms. People who were captured during the Legion's expansion and are now property within an economy that runs on forced labor. The game does not editorialize extensively about this, but it does not need to. The arrangement of the camp, the interactions available with the people held there, the way Legion soldiers speak about their captives, all communicate the moral reality clearly enough. What is less immediately obvious is the degree to which the legionaries at Cottonwood Cove are themselves subject to a rigid hierarchy that offers very little more individual freedom than the slaves below them. The Legion's soldiers are disciplined through a system of reward and punishment that controls their behavior almost as completely as the chains control the people they own. The difference is one of degree and direction, not fundamental type. The boat that provides crossing to the fort, Caesar's main camp on the eastern bank, is operated by a legionary named Cursor Lucullus, whose name follows the Legion's practice of adopting Romanized names as part of membership. That practice, replacing personal names with historical ones, adopting the identity of an imperial project, is one of the most psychologically interesting aspects of the Legion's recruitment process, examined quietly through the names of every named legionary in the game. Camp Forlorn Hope sits at the southern tip of NCR presence in the Mojave, a forward operating base that is perpetually under pressure and perpetually short of resources. The name is accurate. The camp has the quality of an installation that its occupants have stopped expecting to be relieved, whose soldiers have accepted that their position is strategically necessary and personally unsustainable. The quests involving Camp Forlorn Hope deal with supply shortages, morale problems, medical challenges, and the ongoing threat from the Legion camp across the river. The camp's commanding officer, Major Palatli, has the tired competence of a military officer who is doing everything correctly and still losing. His situational awareness is clear. He understands the resource constraints, the Legion's advantages, the gap between what his unit needs and what the NCR can provide. His requests of the courier are practical and unglamorous: medicine, information, assistance with specific operational problems. He does not ask for heroics. He asks for the kind of steady support that his situation actually requires. The NCR soldiers at Camp Forlorn Hope have individual stories available through conversation, reasons for joining the military, thoughts about the Mojave campaign, feelings about the political objectives they are being asked to die for. Some of them believe in what they are doing. Some of them are there because of circumstances that left military service as the most available option. Some of them are tired in a way that they express carefully, aware that the kind of tire they feel is not something the chain of command wants to hear about. These conversations are optional and brief, but they accumulate into a picture of an army that is made of people rather than institutional abstractions, people with the full range of human responses to the situation they find themselves in, asking the player for the kind of help that makes the difference between a defensible position and an abandoned one. The Mojave Outpost sits at the southern edge of the Mojave, where the main road crosses from NCR-controlled California into the contested wasteland, and it functions as a transit checkpoint, a waiting area, and a place where caravans and travelers accumulate while deciding whether to proceed. The women waiting there for travel companions have been stranded by circumstances that the game's questline addresses. A broken road north means no caravans moving, which means no safe passage, which means the NCR civilians are indefinitely stuck between the safety they left and the destination they cannot reach. The questline that involves the Mojave Outpost, pressing matters and others associated with it, deals with infrastructure in the most literal sense, a fallen overpass blocking a road, the downstream effects on commerce and travel, the question of whether the player's involvement can restore movement to a system that has stopped. It is not a glamorous quest. There are no major faction implications, no effects on the battle at Hoover Dam. It is simply a road that needs clearing so that people can move. That specificity, the choice to include quests about blocked roads and stranded travelers, rather than only about political revolutions, is part of what made New Vegas feel like a complete world rather than a quest delivery mechanism. Hoover Dam matters enormously. The blocked road matters to the people stuck in the Mojave Outpost waiting area. Both are real. Both deserve attention. The game was built by people who believed that. Ranger Ghost, encountered near the Mojave Outpost lookout tower, surveys the desert with binoculars and delivers intelligence reports about the road south. She is one of the game's most efficient minor characters, present, informative, operating with quiet professional purpose in a location that most players pass through quickly. The detail that she notices the player's approach before being spoken to, under the right conditions, is exactly the kind of quiet competence that the NCR's better soldiers exemplify. The gun shop in Good Springs, operated by the merchant Chet, contains a back room that is not accessible during normal gameplay, but whose existence is implied by the building's layout. The items visible behind the counter represent a portion of Chet's inventory, and the game's economy allows negotiation of better prices through reputation or speech checks. Chet himself is not a particularly developed character. He is primarily a functional merchant, but his position in Good Springs as someone who provides equipment to a community that needs it connects him to the town's survival in a way that makes his initial reluctance to offer discounts understandable. The pre-war quality of some items available in Good Springs reflects the town's position on what was presumably a significant highway before the war. Travelers passing through would have needed supplies, and the commercial infrastructure to serve them would have been in place. That commercial history, the pre-war gas station, the bar, the general store, represents continuity across the apocalypse, the same basic functions maintained by different people in different circumstances with largely the same purpose. This pattern of commercial continuity, where the types of services available in any given location correspond roughly to the types of services that would have been economically justified by pre-war geography, is one of the background organizational principles of New Vegas's world building. It is never stated directly, but it makes the wasteland legible in a particular way. You can understand why a trading post exists where it does by looking at the terrain and the roads around it, because those factors worked the same way before the war and have simply reasserted themselves after it. The Good Spring Cemetery, where the courier's grave sits at the beginning of the game, is managed informally by the community. The headstones are handmade but carefully done. The graves are spaced with intention. The whole small plot reflects the care of people who have decided that their dead deserve a specific kind of attention. That decision, made in a desert where survival is the primary preoccupation, is its own quiet statement about what Good Springs considers worth maintaining. The Vicky and Vance exhibit inside the Prim Casino includes, alongside the car and the promotional materials, a small display of items associated with the couple's historical activities, replicas of items from their famous last crime, props from the promotional materials the casino used for its pre-war advertisements. The gift shop stocked with memorabilia represents a whole commercial apparatus built around romanticizing a specific kind of outlaw story, the kind of story that appealed to pre-war culture's complicated relationship with transgression. The casino's pre-war advertising, preserved in the promotional materials around the exhibit, used language that is clearly visible as marketing, while also carrying a genuine enthusiasm for the story it is selling. Vicky and Vance were real people in the Fallout universe, criminals who operated in the pre-war Southwest, and whose final confrontation with law enforcement was sufficiently dramatic to generate the kind of cultural afterlife that produces tourist attractions and gift shops. What the exhibit communicates about pre-war culture is the same thing that the celebrity gossip magazines and the entertainment programming of the old world communicate, that the civilization which ended was deeply interested in stories about people who broke the rules and got away with it for a while. That interest survived the apocalypse in the form of the kings in Freeside, who organized their entire community around another outlaw icon. The culture preserved what it found compelling, even when the civilization that produced it was gone. Prim Slim's guided tour of the exhibit, delivered with the same unwavering enthusiasm to the courier in 210 years of post-war isolation as he would have delivered to the 1,000th tourist in the casino's opening week, is one of the game's most quietly melancholy details. The performance continues because the performer was built to perform it. The audience is gone, but the show runs. The Fiends are one of New Vegas's most immediate early game threats, a gang of chem-addicted raiders operating in the Mojave between Freeside and Camp McCarran, organized under a leader named Motor Runner, who operates from the NCR Correctional Facility. Their presence in areas close to New Vegas means that the approaches to the Strip are not entirely safe, and encounters with Fiend patrols in the early game communicate clearly that proximity to civilization does not guarantee security. What distinguishes the Fiends from some of the other raider factions in the game is the degree to which their behavior is explicitly connected to chem addiction. The game is direct about the fact that their erratic, destructive conduct is connected to sustained chemical dependency that has altered how they process the world around them. That framing shifts them from purely threatening figures to something more complicated, without removing the threat they pose or the damage they cause. Motor Runner himself, accessible through a quest involving the NCR's desire to eliminate Fiend leadership, is more coherent than his followers, capable of conversation that reveals a person who has made specific choices and arrived at specific conclusions about what the Mojave offers someone in his position. He is not sympathetic in any simple way, but he is legible in a way that makes him feel like a person rather than a boss encounter. The area the Fiends control contains several small details about what happens to spaces when the people inhabiting them have stopped caring about their maintenance. Buildings used without the consideration that originally organized them, resources consumed without the planning that originally distributed them. The Fiend-controlled zones look different from NCR-controlled zones, and different from independent settlements. And the visual language of that difference tells a story about the relationship between social organization and the physical environments it produces. Boulder City ruins, the bombed out section outside the main settlement, hold the remains of the events from the first battle of Hoover Dam in ways that make history tactile. Shell casings, structural damage, the particular pattern of destruction that artillery and infantry combat leaves behind. These things are visible in the landscape if you look for them, the physical record of a battle that defines how every major faction in the Mojave thinks about power and its limits. The first battle is discussed from multiple perspectives throughout the game, and the version you piece together from the available accounts is richer than any single source provides. The NCR records emphasize the tactical achievement of holding the dam against superior Legion numbers. The Legion's perspective, available through dialogue with Legion characters, emphasizes the strategic lessons the defeat taught Caesar about adapting his military doctrine. The great Khans, who were betrayed during the battle according to their own account, carry a version that neither the NCR nor the Legion particularly acknowledges. The physical ruins outside Boulder City make that contested history present in a specific way. Whatever the accounts say, someone built those walls, and someone's decision destroyed them, and the material evidence of that destruction has been sitting in the desert for years. History in the Mojave is never entirely past. It persists as landscape, as architecture, as the shape of communities organized around what happened in specific places. Chief Hanlon, the ranger stationed at Camp Golf, who helped coordinate the first battle's NCR strategy, is one of the game's most quietly burdened characters, a man who won something at a cost he cannot stop calculating, whose professional competence has not resolved the moral questions his decisions raised. His quest line, which deals with his current choices rather than his past ones, connects the weight of the first battle to the ongoing questions about what the NCR's Mojave campaign is actually accomplishing. The Honest Heart's downloadable content, set in Zion National Park in Utah, takes the courier into a setting that is genuinely different from the Mojave. Lush, green, organized around water and vegetation rather than sand and neon, home to tribal communities that have been largely insulated from the political conflicts shaping the rest of the post-war West. The contrast between Zion's natural beauty and the Mojave's industrial decay is deliberate and creates an immediate atmospheric shift when the content begins. The new Canaanites and the Sorrows who inhabit Zion carry their own histories and belief systems that predate the events of the game, and the content explores how those belief systems interact with the arrival of the courier and the threat represented by a group called the White Legs. The central figure, a man known as the Burned Man, Joshua Graham, the former legate of Caesar's Legion, who survived an execution by fire and rebuilt himself in the canyons of Utah, is one of the most complex characters in any Fallout game. Graham's arc in Honest Hearts deals with the question of whether violence committed in service of justice is the same as violence committed in service of conquest, whether a person defined by their capacity for harm can find a version of themselves that serves something worth serving. His faith, his gentleness in specific contexts, and his absolute readiness to act with deadly precision when he judges it necessary create a portrait of someone who has not resolved the contradictions in their nature, but has found a way to live inside them. The canyons of Zion in the game are designed with a different visual vocabulary than any other New Vegas location: layered sandstone, running water, actual green vegetation, and the effect is of a world that survived differently, that was not destroyed by what destroyed everything else. The park's remoteness is its protection, which raises its own questions about what isolation costs and what it preserves. The Old World Blues downloadable content is perhaps the most conceptually unusual piece of content in Fallout New Vegas, set entirely in the Big Mati Research Complex, a pre-war scientific installation so committed to its own research programs that it continued operating after the bombs fell, staffed by scientists whose brains were removed and placed into robotic chassis, a fact that the scientists themselves have trouble processing, their memories and self-concept having not fully adapted to what was done to them. The Big MT scientists, collectively referred to as the think tank, are funny in the way that only genuinely terrifying situations can be funny. Their dialogue is full of recursive confusion about their own nature, enthusiastic engagement with experiments that have been running for 2 centuries without supervision, complete inability to process the implications of what they are doing. They are brilliant and broken in equal measure, and the game uses their condition as a vehicle for examining what happens when intellect is completely divorced from ethical grounding. The courier arrives at Big MT having had their brain, spine, and heart removed and replaced with technological equivalents, which creates the unusual situation of the player characters spending an entire content module technically without several major organs. The game finds considerable humor in this situation without fully abandoning the unsettling implications of the premise. You are operating in a world built by scientists who removed their own brains, and your own brain has been removed and is being held somewhere in the facility. The pre-war history of Big MT, reconstructed through terminal entries and dialogue, reveals a research culture that was already detached from ordinary human concerns before the war, a place where the boundary between legitimate scientific inquiry and something else was crossed so gradually that no one individual ever had to make a single clear decision to cross it. The scientists arrived at horror through a series of individually justifiable steps, which is the kind of moral history the Fallout series finds most worth exploring. The courier's relationship with the Mojave changes depending on which companions travel alongside them at any given moment, not because the world changes, but because the filter through which it is observed changes. Boone observes the Mojave with a sharpshooter's attention to long distances and sight lines, a professional assessment of terrain as threat landscape. Veronica observes it with the eyes of someone who grew up hearing about the surface world from behind bunker walls and is now finally living in it. Cass, the caravan operator who joins after the investigation of her destroyed caravan, observes it with the specific knowledge of someone who has spent her adult life traveling its roads and learning its rhythms. Each companion brings their own prior knowledge to the shared experience of moving through the wasteland, and their comments reflect that prior knowledge rather than a generic observation of the scene in front of them. This creates the interesting effect of the same landscape feeling different depending on who you have brought along to see it, not because the landscape itself changes, but because different kinds of attention reveal different aspects of it. Cass, in particular, has a relationship to the Mojave's trade routes that no other companion shares. She knows the roads, she knows the water sources, she knows the places where caravans get hit and the places where they are safe. She knows which merchants are honest and which ones are not. Her knowledge is the kind that is built from years of practical experience rather than formal training, and it gives her a different kind of authority when she speaks about the wasteland than the authority that Arcade's medical training or Veronica's Brotherhood education provides. The fact that these companions were each written as people who had been living in the Mojave before the courier arrived and will continue living in it after the courier's specific story concludes gives them a grounding that characters who exist only in relation to the player never quite achieve. They have their own pasts and their own futures, and the courier's journey is an episode in lives that extend beyond its frame. The Powder Gangers as a faction represent a particular kind of post-war organization, people whose social bonds were formed under shared adversity, in this case, the specific adversity of forced labor building railroads for the NCR's infrastructure expansion in the Mojave. Their resentment of the NCR is not ideological in the way that the Legion's opposition or even the Great Khan's grievance is ideological. It is personal, rooted in specific experiences of captivity and coerced labor. The NCR Correctional Facility, which the Powder Gangers now occupy after overrunning its guards during a riot, is one of the game's more interesting early locations. The prison infrastructure reflects the NCR's institutional practice of pressing convicted criminals into labor service, a policy that the game presents without strongly editorializing, allowing the player to assess it through the evidence of what it produced. A large number of people with specific grievances and eventually access to explosives. The Powder Gangers' name comes from the black powder explosives they worked with during railroad construction and subsequently acquired when they escaped. Their tactical signature, using those explosives in ambushes and traps rather than as demolition tools, reflects an improvised adaptation of work knowledge to conflict purposes. They knew how to handle the powder because the NCR trained them to handle it, and now they use it against NCR operations. Eddie, the leader of the correctional facility Powder Gangers, is more organized and less chaotic than his followers, capable of the kind of sustained planning that the faction's continued existence requires. Speaking with him reveals someone who has thought seriously about what the Powder Gangers are and what they could become, even if the vision he describes involves continued antagonism with the NCR rather than any more constructive alternative. The landscape of the Mojave contains numerous pre-war locations that are now partially buried or structurally altered by decades of neglect, erosion, and the particular environmental effects of the nuclear conflict that ended the Old World. Buildings that were intact when the bombs fell have in the intervening 2 centuries begun the process of returning to the desert, foundations cracking, walls sagging, roofs collapsing under the weight of time and the occasional radiation storm. The visual grammar of this decay is one of the game's consistent aesthetic achievements. The distinction between a building that fell on the day the bombs dropped and one that has been slowly failing for 200 years is visible in how the damage is distributed, in the way vegetation has or has not begun reclaiming the structure, in the degree to which the original architectural intention is still legible beneath the deterioration. Some structures are more resistant to this decay than others. The vaults are designed to last, their sealed environments preserving a version of the pre-war world in amber. The larger institutional buildings, government facilities, corporate headquarters, major commercial establishments, have held their shapes better than residential structures, their heavier construction providing more resistance to the gradual work of time. The smallest buildings, the houses and shacks and temporary structures, have suffered most. Goodsprings exists at a particular point in this continuum, old enough to show decay, intact enough to remain functional, neither fresh enough to feel recent, nor ruined enough to feel abandoned. Its buildings carry the specific quality of structures that people have been maintaining imperfectly for years, patched rather than rebuilt, held together by ongoing attention rather than original quality. The Securitrons that serve as New Vegas's primary enforcement mechanism are one of the game's most distinctive visual elements. Humanoid robots with monitor screens for faces, displaying animated expressions that shift with their operational state. The cheerful face displayed during normal operation, the threatening expression during combat alerts, the specific display that appears when Mr. House is communicating through them. These visual states communicate the robot's function and mood with a directness that makes them immediately legible, even to players encountering them for the first time. The Securitron model is a pre-war Robco product, manufactured before the war and deployed across New Vegas as part of Mr. House's preparatory work. The Mark I Securitrons that players encounter throughout the game are the standard deployment, capable but operating below their theoretical maximum effectiveness. The Platinum chip contains the upgrade data that would bring these machines to Mark II specification, dramatically increasing their combat capability, which is precisely why the chip was worth killing a courier over. Victor, the Securitron who digs the courier out of their grave in the opening sequence, is a particular unit that Mr. House has been using for personal communication and surveillance for years. Victor has a distinctive personality compared to the standard Securitrons, warmer, more conversational, more apparently individual, which reflects either genuine personality development through years of specialized function or a specific programming configuration that House created for this unit. The game leaves that question gently open. The ending slides for certain game outcomes describe what happens to the Securitron network depending on which faction controls the Mojave. Under House, they become the primary enforcement arm of an independent New Vegas. Under the NCR, they are reprogrammed for NCR purposes or decommissioned. Under the Legion, they are destroyed, reflecting the Legion's categorical rejection of advanced technology as part of their civilizational project. The Mojave's weather patterns, visible during gameplay in the form of atmospheric changes and dust storms that reduce visibility across the desert, are implemented with enough variety to make the environment feel like a genuinely dynamic place rather than a static backdrop. Dust storms in particular create moments where the world contracts dramatically, the horizon disappears, landmarks become unreliable, and movement through the desert becomes a different kind of experience than it is under clear conditions. The dust storms have no mechanical effect on gameplay. They do not slow movement, they do not increase enemy spawns, they do not change the behavior of NPCs. They are purely visual, an atmospheric element added to make the Mojave feel like a real desert, with real weather rather than a painted landscape. That absence of mechanical consequence is itself a kind of design choice. The weather is there for the feeling it creates, not for any strategic function it serves. Rain in the Mojave is rare, and when it occurs, it is another purely atmospheric event. The sound and visual of precipitation in a landscape that is defined by its aridity, a reminder that the desert is not categorically hostile to water, but simply accustomed to its absence. The game does not make rain significant in any narrative sense, but it creates a small shift in the quality of the time you are spending in the wasteland. The lighting changes associated with different times of day and different weather conditions are one of the game's technical achievements that most players absorb without consciously registering. The way the Mojave looks at dawn versus midday versus sunset versus night is genuinely different, and the difference contributes to the varying emotional texture of exploration at different times. The game was built by people who understood that how a place looks shapes how it feels to be in it. The merchant caravans that travel the Mojave between settlements represent the economic connective tissue of the wasteland, moving goods between communities that could not produce everything they need and would not survive in complete isolation. 3 major caravan companies operate in the region: the Crimson Caravan Company, the Fargo Traders, and the Gun Runners, each with their own business practices, their own relationships with different settlements, and their own positions in the Mojave's commercial politics. The Crimson Caravan Company operates from a base camp outside New Vegas and has the most formal corporate structure of the 3, an actual company rather than an informal operation, with employees rather than partners, policies rather than customs. Their quest line involves the company's market practices and a conflict with a smaller independent operation that reflects the tension between organized commercial enterprise and individual entrepreneurship in the post-war economy. Fargo Traders is the smallest and most informal of the 3 operations, run in a way that resembles a pre-war independent business more than a corporation. The traders who work for Fargo have more individual autonomy and less institutional support, which means they take more personal risk and operate with more flexibility than Crimson Caravan employees. The existence of these competing commercial operations, each with their own history and character and customer relationships, suggests an economy that has developed sufficient complexity to support specialization and competition rather than simple survival exchange. The Mojave has not rebuilt civilization in the way that the Old World would have recognized it, but it has rebuilt enough of its commercial infrastructure to produce companies, competition, and the slow accumulation of institutional knowledge that makes commerce sustainable. The streets of Freeside tell a different story than the buildings. The buildings are pre-war structures converted to post-war purposes: bars, clinics, weapons shops, unofficial residences, and spaces originally designed for other things. But the streets between them have been organized by the community that lives there, divided informally into territories and uses that reflect the social organization of a place managing its own affairs without formal governance. The followers' presence near the old Mormon fort anchors one end of Freeside's social geography. The kings operate from their school of impersonation at another point. Between them, independent merchants, travelers passing through, and permanent residents have organized a kind of informal civic life that is recognizably urban even in its post-apocalyptic form. Zones of activity, patterns of traffic, the small negotiations of space that constitute neighborhood life in any dense community. The NCR refugees who have accumulated in Freeside create pressure on this informal arrangement. They need resources that Freeside does not have in sufficient quantity, and their presence strains the relationship between the kings, who view Freeside as their territory, and the NCR military, that views the refugees as its responsibility. The questline GWAM Blues asks the courier to navigate this tension, looking for the source of a pattern of violence against NCR citizens that threatens to collapse whatever fragile equilibrium exists. The solution the game offers: finding the actual source of the violence and addressing it, rather than forcing a broader political confrontation between the kings and the NCR, reflects New Vegas's characteristic preference for specific, targeted interventions over sweeping political gestures. The street-level problem has a street-level solution, and finding it requires treating the situation as a puzzle rather than a conflict. The desert has grown quiet now. The neon of New Vegas is still out there, somewhere beyond the dark stretch of open sand, steady and bright and patient. Let it rest there for now. You have drifted through enough of the Mojave's small wonders for one night, through its odd corners and gentle absurdities, through the details that no loading screen tip will ever mention and no quest marker will ever point toward. They are there if you return. They will still be there, patient as the desert, exactly as useless and exactly as perfect as they have always been. Thanks for watching. If you felt calm wandering through these soft moments, there's another video on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play as you settle in. It might guide you into an even deeper rest.